The children in the wagon. Ethan Cole had hauled freight across the Sonoran Desert for 7 years without incident, until the day he found 20 children locked inside a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere, half of them already dead. No tracks led to it, no horses stood nearby. Just canvas slashed open, burn marks scorching the wood, and the unbearable stench of death baking under the Arizona sun. When 3 armed men arrived claiming the survivors were cargo to be collected, Ethan understood he'd stumbled into something far worse than abandonment. He'd found a trade route, and the only thing standing between those children and a fate worse than the desert was a man with 1 horse, half a canteen, and 40 miles of burning sand ahead. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Ethan's story travels. And if this one grabs you, hit that like button and stick around till the end. You won't regret it. The desert didn't lie. Ethan Cole had learned that truth the hard way, through 7 years of hauling freight across the territories where most men feared to tread. The Sonoran stretch between Tucson and Yuma was a killer. 120 miles of sand, rock, and sun so fierce it could blister paint off a wagon wheel. But it paid well, and Ethan had learned to read the land like other men read newspapers. He knew where the water was. He knew which trails held firm and which would swallow a wagon axle deep in sand. He knew the rhythm of the wind, the color of the sky before a storm, and the particular quality of silence that meant you were alone. That's why the wagon bothered him. It sat a quarter-mile off the main trail, listing slightly to one side where the right rear wheel had sunk into softer ground. The canvas top was torn, flapping weakly in the hot wind. No horses, no mules. No tracks leading to it or away from it, which was impossible. You didn't get a freight wagon into the middle of the desert without something pulling it, and you didn't abandon a rig that size without leaving boot prints in the sand. Ethan pulled his own wagon to a halt, his mare Greta snorting softly as he set the brake. The sun was directly overhead, turning the world into a furnace of white light and black shadow. He'd planned to push through to the water station at Sentinel Butte before nightfall, but something about that abandoned wagon pulled at him like a fishhook in his gut. "Easy, girl," he murmured, climbing down. His boots hit the sand with a soft crunch. He pulled his canteen from the wagon bed, took a careful sip. Water was precious out here, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The wind carried something to him then, something that made his stomach tighten. Smoke. Old smoke, the acrid ghost of something burned days ago. And underneath it, something worse. Ethan had been a soldier once, briefly, during the tail end of the Apache campaigns. He'd seen what happened to bodies left in the sun. That smell was something you never forgot, something that lived in the back of your throat long after you thought you'd washed it away. He walked toward the wagon slowly, his hand resting on the Colt holstered at his hip. Not because he expected trouble. There was nothing alive out here but him and Greta, and maybe a few lizards, but because instinct ran deeper than logic. The wagon was a standard freight hauler, 12 feet long with a curved canvas top stretched over wooden ribs. The canvas had been slashed, long deliberate cuts that gaped like wounds. Burn marks scored the wood along the driver's bench, black streaks that spoke of fire hastily started and quickly extinguished. The tailgate hung open, secured by a single chain that dangled loosely. Ethan reached the back of the wagon and stopped. The smell hit him like a physical blow, thick and cloying in the heat. He pulled his bandana up over his nose and mouth, breathing shallowly through the cloth. His hand tightened on his pistol. "Hello?" His voice fell flat in the empty air. "Anyone there?" Silence. He grabbed the edge of the tailgate and pulled himself up, peering into the dim interior. At first, his mind couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. The wagon bed was packed with shapes, bundles maybe, or cargo wrapped in rough cloth. But the shapes were wrong, too small and irregular, and some of them were moving. Then his eyes adjusted to the shadows, and the truth hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Children. 20, maybe more, crammed into the wagon bed like sacks of grain. Some lay completely still, their small faces gray and sunken. Others moved weakly, their breathing shallow and labored. They were dressed in simple clothes, rough cotton shirts and pants, most of them torn or stained. No shoes, no blankets, nothing but the burning heat and the flies that had already begun to gather. Jesus Christ, Ethan breathed, his voice hoarse. A girl near the front stirred at the sound, her eyes opening to narrow slits. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her face covered in dust. "Water," she whispered, the word barely audible. Ethan's paralysis shattered. He holstered his pistol and climbed into the wagon, moving carefully between the small bodies. Some of them were clearly dead, their skin waxy, their eyes open and unseeing. Others were dying, their breathing so faint he had to press his fingers to their throats to feel the weak flutter of pulse. His hands shook as he uncapped his canteen. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough. "I'm going to give you water, but you have to drink it slow. Understand? Just a little at a time." The girl nodded weakly. He lifted her head gently, supporting it with one hand while he held the canteen to her lips with the other. She drank greedily, and he had to pull it away before she made herself sick. "Easy," he murmured. "There's more. I promise." He moved through the wagon, offering water to each child who could still swallow. Some of them couldn't. A boy near the back, maybe 6 years old, tried to drink but couldn't coordinate his throat muscles enough to manage it. The water just ran down his chin, and his eyes rolled back in his head. Ethan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He'd seen cruelty before. He'd seen men do terrible things to each other in anger and desperation, in the mindless chaos of war. But this was different. This was deliberate. Someone had locked these children in this wagon, slashed the canvas to let in the killing heat, and left them here to die in the slowest, most agonizing way possible. The question was why. He finished giving water to the survivors, 7 of them, maybe 8, though 2 looked like they wouldn't last another hour, and climbed out of the wagon. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands trembling with rage and shock. He walked in a slow circle around the wagon, examining the ground more carefully now. Still no tracks. No sign of how the wagon had gotten here or who had brought it. But there were marks in the sand near the front wheels, strange depressions too shallow to be footprints. He crouched beside them, running his fingers over the disturbed sand. Drag marks, maybe. Something heavy pulled across the ground, or someone covering their tracks. Ethan stood, his gaze sweeping the horizon. Nothing moved except the heat shimmer rising from the sand. But someone had done this. Someone had brought these children out here and abandoned them, and whoever it was had been careful about it, too careful. He returned to the wagon and began the grim work of pulling out the dead. There were 11 of them, their small bodies frighteningly light. He laid them in the shade of the wagon as gently as he could, closing their eyes and straightening their limbs. Some of them still had expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Others just looked tired, like they'd fallen asleep and never woken up. By the time he finished, his water was gone and the sun had begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. He had maybe 3 hours of daylight left and 40 miles of desert between him and help. 1 horse, 8 dying children, and no good options. He sat in the sand beside the wagon, his head in his hands, trying to think. Take the children and leave the freight. But his wagon couldn't carry all of them, not safely, and Greta was already tired from pulling a full load all morning. He could make 2 trips, but that would take days, and these kids didn't have days. Leave the children and ride for help. But by the time he came back with a doctor and supplies, they'd all be dead. Stay here and wait for someone to pass by. But this was the Sonoran. Wagons didn't come through here every day. He might wait a week before anyone showed up, and these children would be corpses long before then. There was no good choice, just degrees of bad. A sound made him lift his head, a low groan from inside the wagon. He climbed back in and found the girl he'd given water to earlier, the one who'd been awake. She was sitting up now, her back against the wagon side, her arms wrapped around her knees. "What happened?" Ethan asked gently. "Who did this to you?" The girl's eyes were dark and hollow, too old for her young face. "They said we were going to families," she whispered. "New families. Out west." "Who said that?" "The man in the gray coat. He came to the orphanage in Santa Fe. Said there were people who wanted children, good people with farms and ranches. He said we'd have our own beds and 3 meals a day. And people who'd love us." Ethan's throat tightened. "How many of you were there?" 32. Her voice cracked. We all got on the wagons in Santa Fe. They separated us. Some went north, some went south. We went west. But after 2 days, they stopped giving us food. They stopped letting us out. And then she trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. And then what? They locked us in, covered the wagon, and left us. We could hear them talking outside, but they wouldn't answer when we called. We screamed and screamed. Then it got hot. So hot. And the little one started. She couldn't finish. Ethan's hands curled into fists. How long ago? I don't know. 3 days? 4? I can't remember. 3 or 4 days locked in a wagon in the desert sun with no water, no food, no shade. It was a miracle any of them had survived at all. What's your name? He asked. Iris? Iris, I'm Ethan. I'm going to get you out of here, all right? You and everyone else who's still alive. But I need you to help me. Can you do that? She nodded, though her eyes were uncertain. I need you to tell the others to stay calm. I'm going to move my wagon closer and transfer everyone over. It's going to be cramped, but it's better than staying here. Can you tell them that? Yes, sir. He squeezed her shoulder gently and climbed out of the wagon. As he walked back to Greta, his mind was already working through the logistics. Strip his freight down to the bare essentials. Make room in his wagon bed. Transfer the children carefully. Keep them in the shade as much as possible. Push Greta hard, maybe too hard, but there was no other choice. He was halfway to his wagon when he heard the horses. Ethan froze, his hand dropping to his colt. 3 riders were approaching from the south, moving at an easy lope across the sand. Even from a distance, he could see they were armed, rifles and saddle scabbards, pistols on their hips. They rode with the casual confidence of men who owned the land they crossed. They reined in about 20 yards away, spreading out slightly in a loose semicircle. The man in the center was older, maybe 50, with a neatly trimmed gray beard and a long duster coat despite the heat. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, friend," he called. "Having some trouble?" Ethan didn't move his hand away from his pistol. "Nothing I can't handle." "Looks like you found our cargo." The man's smile widened. "Appreciate you looking after it for us. We'll take it from here." The word hit Ethan like a slap. Cargo. Not children, not people. Cargo. "Your cargo," Ethan repeated slowly. "That's right. Lost track of this particular shipment a few days back. Been looking all over for it." The man gestured to the wagon behind Ethan. "Why don't you step aside and let us collect what's ours?" The other 2 riders shifted in their saddles, their hands drifting toward their weapons. Ethan's mind raced, 3 against 1. He was a decent shot, but not good enough to take all 3 before they cut him down. And even if he could, gunfire would terrify the children. But the alternative was worse. "Those aren't cargo," Ethan said, his voice hard. "They're children, and they're half dead because someone locked them in that wagon and left them to cook." The man's smile faded. "That's a terrible tragedy," he said, his tone flat. "But it doesn't change the facts. They're ours. Bought and paid for." "Bought and paid for?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "You're selling children." "We prefer to call it placement services. Orphans need homes. We connect them with families willing to pay for the privilege. It's a public service, really." "Is that why half of them are dead?" The man shrugged. "Desert's a hard place. Sometimes shipments don't make it. That's the risk." Ethan's hand tightened on his pistol. "You're not taking them." The man sighed, like Ethan was being unreasonable. "Friend, I don't think you understand your situation. There's 3 of us and 1 of you. We've got rifles, you've got a sidearm. This doesn't have to get ugly." "You're right," Ethan said quietly. "It doesn't." He drew his Colt in one smooth motion and fired. The bullet took the man in the center, the one in the gray coat, the one Iris had described, through the right shoulder, spinning him sideways in his saddle. His horse reared, and he tumbled to the ground with a cry of pain. The other 2 riders went for their rifles, but Ethan was already moving. He fired twice more, aiming low, and one of the men's horses screamed and bolted. The rider fought to control it, giving Ethan precious seconds. The 3rd man got his rifle up and fired. The bullet whined past Ethan's ear, close enough that he felt the heat of it. He dove behind his wagon, landing hard in the sand and rolled to his knees. Gunfire cracked across the desert. Bullets thudded into the wagon bed, splintering wood. Greta screamed and lunged against her traces, but the brake held. Ethan risked a glance around the edge of the wagon. The man he'd shot was crawling toward his horse, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. The second rider was still fighting his panicked mount. The third had dismounted and taken cover behind a low rise of rock 30 yards out. Standoff. Ethan's heart pounded. He had 4 bullets left. 3 men, 1 wounded, and 8 children 20 feet away, trapped in a wagon with bullets flying overhead. This was bad. This was very bad. "You're making a mistake, Armas," the man behind the rock shouted. "That's valuable property. You damage it, you'll answer for it." Ethan didn't respond. He was calculating angles, distances, odds. If he could get to Greta, cut her loose, ride for help. But that meant leaving the children, and these men would take them the moment he was out of sight. Number. He had to end this here. A horse's whinny made him look up. A 4th rider was approaching from the west, moving fast. Ethan's stomach sank. If this was another one of theirs? But the newcomer didn't slow down or take cover. He rode straight into the middle of the fight, a tall man on a bay stallion, and when he reached the man behind the rocks, he dismounted and grabbed him by the collar. "What the hell are you doing, Keller?" The newcomer's voice carried clearly across the sand, sharp with authority. The man, Keller, lowered his rifle. "This fool shot Hayes and interfered with the shipment. I don't care." The newcomer released Keller and walked toward Ethan's wagon, his hands raised and empty. He was younger than the others, maybe 40, with dark hair and a clean-shaven face. He wore a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place in the desert. "Hold your fire," he called. "I'm coming in unarmed." Ethan kept his pistol trained on the man as he approached. "That's close enough." The man stopped 10 feet away. "My name is Samuel Garrett. I'm a businessman out of Phoenix. These men work for me, and I apologize for their aggression. There's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Ethan said coldly. "They called those children cargo. They were coming to collect them." Garrett's expression didn't change. "Those children are part of a contracted arrangement. They were being transported to families who paid for their placement. The arrangement was legal and binding." "Legal." Ethan's voice was flat. "You locked 32 kids in wagons and left them to die in the desert. That's murder, not placement." "That was an unfortunate error in judgment by my transport team," Garrett said smoothly. "I assure you, it was never my intention. I don't care about your intentions." Ethan cut him off. "I care about those kids, and they're not going anywhere with you." Garrett studied him for a long moment, his eyes cold and assessing. Then he smiled, and it was the most chilling thing Ethan had seen all day. "You're in over your head, friend. You shot one of my men. You're threatening the rest, and you're standing between me and property I've already sold. Walk away now, and I'll forget this happened. Stay, and I'll make sure you regret it." Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger. "I've already got plenty of regrets. One more won't make a difference." For a long moment, neither man moved. The desert wind hissed across the sand, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Then a small voice broke the silence. "You're a liar." Both men turned. Iris had climbed out of the wagon and stood in the sand, swaying slightly, her thin arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were fixed on Garrett. "You're a liar," she repeated, louder now. "You said we were going to families. You said people wanted us, but there are no families. You were going to sell us." Garrett's expression flickered, just for a second, but Ethan saw it. Surprise. And beneath it, calculation. "Child, you're confused," Garrett said gently. "You've been through a terrible ordeal." "I'm not confused," Iris's voice cracked, but she didn't back down. "I heard you talking to the men in Santa Fe. You said we were worth $50 each. You said the buyers wouldn't care if some of us didn't make it because the rest would be cheaper." The words fell into the silence like stones down a well. Ethan's blood turned to ice. $50 each. Buyers. The pieces clicked together in his mind with sickening clarity. This wasn't about orphan placement. This was a slave market. Garrett's face went very still. Then he looked at Ethan, and his smile was gone, replaced by something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "The girl's delirious," he said quietly. "Heat does that. Makes people imagine things." "She doesn't sound delirious to me," Garrett's hand moved toward his coat, and Ethan raised his pistol. Don't. The businessmen froze. For a long moment, they stood facing each other, the tension so thick Ethan could taste it. Then Garrett lowered his hand and stepped back. This isn't over, he said softly. You've made a very powerful enemy today, Mr. Cole. Ethan Cole. And I don't give a damn how powerful you are. Garrett smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You will. He turned and walked back toward his horse, moving with unhurried confidence. Keller and the other man helped the wounded Hayes mount up, and within minutes, all four of them were riding away, heading south toward the distant mountains. Ethan didn't lower his pistol until they were out of rifle range. Then his legs gave out, and he sat down hard in the sand, his hands shaking violently. Iris walked over and stood beside him, small and fragile in the harsh sunlight. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan looked up at her, at this brave, broken child who'd just stared down a monster and called him a liar to his face. Something in his chest cracked open. We're not out of this yet, he said hoarsely. But I promise you, Iris, I'm going to get you somewhere safe. All of you. She nodded and sat down beside him, and together they watched the empty desert, waiting for whatever came next. The silence after the riders disappeared felt heavier than the heat. Ethan remained sitting in the sand beside Iris, his pistol still in his hand, watching the horizon until the dust settled completely. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, adrenaline making his fingers tremble. He'd shot a man today. Maybe not fatally, but he'd drawn blood, and men like Garrett didn't forget that kind of thing. Mr. Cole? Iris's voice was small. Are they coming back? Ethan looked down at her, at the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. I don't know, he said honestly, but we're not going to be here when they do. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs steadier now, and offered Iris his hand. She took it, and he pulled her up gently. The other children were stirring in the wagon, their faces appearing at the torn canvas opening. They looked like ghosts, pale, hollow-eyed, their lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. All right, Ethan said, his voice firm despite the uncertainty churning in his gut. Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to move my wagon over here, and we're going to get all of you transferred. It's going to be tight, but it's better than staying in that oven. Can you help me explain that to the others? Iris nodded and climbed back into the wagon. Ethan heard her soft voice murmuring to the other children as he walked to Greta. His mare was still agitated from the gunfire, her ears pinned back, her sides heaving. He stroked her neck, speaking low and calm until she settled. I know, girl, I know, but we've got work to do. He unhitched Greta from his freight wagon and led her to the abandoned rig, positioning his wagon alongside it. Then he began the methodical work of unloading his freight, barrels of flour, crates of tools, rolls of canvas meant for a merchant in Yuma. Everything went into the sand, carefully arranged so he could come back for it later. If there was a later. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Ethan worked quickly, sweat soaking through his shirt, his muscles burning with effort. When his wagon bed was finally clear, he lined it with the canvas he'd been hauling and spread his bedroll across it to create a softer surface. Then he returned to the children. 7 were conscious enough to move on their own, though they needed help climbing down from the wagon. Ethan lifted each one carefully, shocked by how light they were, how fragile their bones felt beneath his hands. He settled them in his wagon bed, arranging them so they weren't crushing each other, giving each one a small sip from his remaining water. There was an 8th child, the boy who hadn't been able to swallow earlier. Ethan found him in the back corner of the wagon, curled on his side, his chest barely moving. His skin was gray, his lips blue. When Ethan pressed his fingers to the boy's throat, the pulse was so faint he could barely feel it. Come on, son, Ethan murmured, gathering the boy into his arms. Stay with me. He carried the boy to his wagon and laid him in Iris's lap. She looked down at him with ancient eyes, then up at Ethan. That's Thomas, she said quietly. He's 6. His mama died last year, and his papa couldn't keep him. He cries at night sometimes, but he tries to be quiet so nobody hears. Ethan's throat tightened. He reached out and smoothed the boy's hair back from his forehead. The skin was burning hot, fever eating him alive from the inside. You watch over him, Iris. Keep him cool as you can. Yes, sir. Ethan returned to the abandoned wagon for the last time, checking every corner to make sure he hadn't missed anyone. The bodies of the dead children still lay in the shade where he'd placed them, their small faces peaceful now. He couldn't take them with him, there wasn't room, and the living had to come first. But he couldn't leave them to the vultures either. He spent the next 20 minutes gathering rocks from the surrounding desert and piling them over the bodies, building cairns that would at least keep the scavengers away until he could send someone back with proper burial equipment. By the time he finished, his back was screaming and his hands were bleeding from the rough stone. The sun touched the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Ethan climbed onto his wagon seat, his body moving on pure determination now. He was out of water. He had 8 dying children and 40 miles of desert between him and help. Greta was already tired, and pulling a wagon full of passengers would push her to her limits. But there was no other choice. "Hold on," he said to the children behind him. "This is going to be rough." He released the brake and snapped the reins. Greta leaned into her harness, and the wagon lurched forward. The first mile was agony. The wagon wheels caught in soft sand every few yards, and Ethan had to climb down repeatedly to push while Greta strained. The children whimpered with each jolt, and Ethan's heart broke a little more each time he heard them cry out. By the second mile, Thomas had stopped breathing. Iris's voice was remarkably steady when she called out, "Mr. Cole, Thomas isn't moving anymore." Ethan pulled Greta to a halt and climbed into the wagon bed. Thomas lay in Iris's lap, his small chest still, his eyes half open and unseeing. Ethan pressed his fingers to the boy's throat, knowing what he'd find but needing to check anyway. Nothing. He closed Thomas's eyes gently and lifted him from Iris's arms. The other children watched in silence, their faces blank with shock and exhaustion. Ethan carried Thomas to the back of the wagon and wrapped him in a piece of canvas, securing it with rope. He'd add the boy to the cairns when he came back, if he came back. "I'm sorry," Iris whispered when he returned to the driver's seat. "Me too." He drove on as the sun sank lower, the temperature finally beginning to drop. The desert twilight was brief but beautiful, the sky turning deep purple shot through with gold. Stars began to appear, hard and bright in the gathering darkness. Ethan lit the lantern hanging from his wagon frame and kept driving. He couldn't stop. Every hour counted. Every minute might mean the difference between life and death for the children behind him. Around midnight, one of the little girls started crying. Not the weak, exhausted whimpers he'd been hearing, but full-throated sobs that spoke of pain and fear and desperation. Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt and turned around. "What's wrong?" Iris was holding the girl, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Her name's Mary. She says her stomach hurts real bad." Ethan climbed into the wagon bed and knelt beside them. In the lantern light, Mary's face was pale and pinched, her small hands clutching her belly. When he touched her forehead, she was burning with fever. "Where does it hurt, Mary?" She pointed to her lower right abdomen. When Ethan pressed gently, she screamed. His blood ran cold. He'd seen this before during his brief time as a soldier. A man in his unit had developed the same symptoms: fever, abdominal pain that made him scream when you touched it. The surgeon had called it appendicitis. The man had died 3 days later when the appendix burst and poison flooded his body. If Mary had the same thing, she needed a surgeon. Not tomorrow or the next day, but now. Ethan looked at the other children. They were watching him with wide eyes, waiting to see what he'd do. He thought about Garrett's words. "You're in over your head, friend." Maybe he was. Maybe this whole thing was impossible. Maybe he should have left them, ridden for help, let someone else deal with this nightmare. But he hadn't, and he wouldn't. "Iris," he said quietly, "I need you to hold Mary's hand and keep her calm. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." Ethan returned to the driver's seat and picked up the reins. Greta's head was hanging low, exhausted, but when he snapped the leather, she leaned into her harness and pulled. He drove through the night without stopping, the lantern swinging with each jolt of the wheels, casting wild shadows across the sand. The temperature dropped steadily, and Ethan wrapped the children in every piece of fabric he had, his spare shirt, the canvas scraps, even the saddle blanket. They huddled together for warmth, their breathing shallow and labored. Mary's cries gradually weakened, fading to whimpers and then to silence. Ethan didn't dare look back. He just kept driving, his hands locked on the reins, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale blue. Ethan's eyes burned with exhaustion, his body moving on instinct alone. Greta was stumbling now, her head bobbing with each step. They'd covered maybe 15 miles through the night, 25 left to go. "Mr. Cole?" He turned. Iris was standing behind him, swaying with the wagon's movement. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were clear. "Mary's gone," she said simply. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, Iris was still watching him, waiting for guidance. A child waiting for an adult to tell her what to do, even though all the adults in her life had failed her. "Go sit down, Iris. I'll take care of her." "No." Her voice was soft but firm. "I want to help." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Together they wrapped Mary in canvas and laid her beside Thomas. 6 children left now, 6 out of 32. The sun climbed higher, and the heat returned with a vengeance. Ethan's lips cracked and bled. His tongue felt swollen in his mouth. The children had stopped asking for water. There was none to give. They just lay in the wagon bed, their eyes half closed, their breathing rapid and shallow. Around midday, Ethan spotted something on the horizon. At first he thought it was another heat mirage, but as they drew closer, it resolved into a definite shape. A rider on horseback, moving toward them at a steady pace. Ethan's hand dropped to his Colt. If this was Garrett or his men coming back. But as the rider drew nearer, Ethan saw the glint of metal on his chest. A badge. The man rode up and reined in his horse, a sturdy paint that looked fresh despite the heat. He was in his 50s, with weathered skin and gray hair beneath a wide-brimmed hat. His eyes took in the scene, the exhausted horse, the overloaded wagon, Ethan's haggard face, and his expression darkened. "Name's Marshal Beckett," he said. "Out of Sentinel Station. Got a telegram yesterday about some trouble on the desert road. You Ethan Cole?" Ethan stared at him, his mind struggling to process the words. "How? Fellow named Hayes rode into Sentinel last night with a bullet in his shoulder. Started making noise about being shot by a claim jumper. My deputy got suspicious when Hayes couldn't explain what claim he was working or why he was 40 miles from the nearest mine. Leaned on him a little, and he spilled the whole story." Beckett's eyes moved to the wagon bed. "How many you got?" "6 alive. 2 dead in the back." The marshal's jaw tightened. Hayes mentioned children. Didn't say anything about them being dead. "There's 11 more about 15 miles back. I built cairns, but they need proper burial." Beckett was quiet for a moment, his hand resting on his saddle horn. Then he nodded. "I've got a doctor and 2 deputies about 2 miles behind me. We brought water and medical supplies." He looked at Greta, who was standing with her head down, her sides heaving. "Your horse is about done. We'll switch her out for a fresh mount and get these kids to Sentinel." Ethan felt something crack inside his chest, something that had been holding him together through the long night and the impossible miles. His vision blurred, and he realized he was crying, silent tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "Easy, son." Beckett's voice was gentle. "You did good. You got them this far." Ethan shook his head. "I didn't get them all." "No, but you got enough." The doctor arrived 20 minutes later, a compact man with quick hands and kind eyes named Patterson. He climbed into the wagon bed and began examining the children while his deputies set up a makeshift camp. They had 4 horses laden with water barrels and medical equipment, and within minutes the children were drinking in careful sips while Patterson checked their vital signs. "This one needs fluids immediately," Patterson said, indicating a boy who'd been unconscious since Ethan found them. "The rest are severely dehydrated and malnourished, but they'll recover with proper care." Ethan sat in the sand and watched the doctor work, too exhausted to move. Beckett sat down beside him and offered a canteen. Ethan drank greedily, the water like salvation on his cracked lips. "Hayes and his companions are in my jail," Beckett said, "along with the man who shot at you, fellow named Keller. They're singing like canaries now that they know the alternative is a noose." "What about Garrett?" Ethan's voice was hoarse. Beckett's expression went grim. "Samuel Garrett is a different problem. He's got connections. politicians, businessmen, even some judges. He's been running this operation for years, using orphanages as recruiting grounds. Promises the children homes, sells them to whoever's willing to pay. Mostly they end up in brothels or as slave labor. The ones who die in transport, he shrugged, just overhead as far as he's concerned. You're going to arrest him. It wasn't a question, but Beckett answered anyway. I'm going to try. But men like Garrett don't go down easy. He'll lawyer up, claim he had no knowledge of how his transport teams operated, say he was horrified when he found out. Might even get away with it. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. Those children testified against him. Iris told me what she heard. Iris is 8 years old. In court, a good defense attorney would tear her apart. And even if she holds up, Garrett's lawyers will argue she was confused, traumatized, mistaken. Beckett sighed. I've been a lawman for 30 years, Cole. I've seen guilty men walk free more times than I can count. Sometimes the law isn't enough. Then what is? Beckett looked at him steadily. Sometimes it takes good men willing to stand up when the law fails. Men willing to do what's right even when it's hard. They sat in silence for a while, watching the doctor work. One of the deputies brought fresh horses, and they began the process of transferring the children to a larger wagon with better suspension. Iris supervised the move, making sure each child was comfortable, tucking blankets around the smallest ones. She's something special, that girl, Beckett observed. Took care of the others the whole time they were locked up, according to the ones who can talk. Gave them her water, told them stories to keep them calm. She's got steel in her spine. Ethan watched Iris arrange a makeshift pillow for one of the younger boys. What's going to happen to them? Orphanage in Tucson, most likely. It's run by the Catholic sisters, and they're good people. The children will be safe there while we track down their families, if they have any. Beckett paused. What about you? What are you going to do? Ethan didn't answer right away. He thought about Garrett's smile, cold and confident. He thought about the 11 small cairns in the desert and the 2 canvas-wrapped bundles in his wagon. He thought about Iris's voice saying, "You're a liar," and the courage it must have taken for a child to stand up to a monster. I don't know yet, he said finally. Beckett nodded like that was answer enough. Well, when you figure it out, you know where to find me. By late afternoon, they were ready to move. The children were loaded into the larger wagon, comfortable now on padded beds with plenty of water and some hardtack to ease their hunger. Dr. Patterson would ride with them, monitoring their conditions. One of the deputies would drive while the other rode scout. Beckett and Ethan rode together on fresh horses, leading Greta on a line behind them. The mare was walking better now after rest and water, but she'd need days to fully recover. Ethan's freight was still scattered in the desert, but Beckett promised to send a team to collect it. As they rode, Iris called out from the wagon. Mr. Cole? Ethan brought his horse alongside. What is it? Where are you going? After Sentinel, I mean. It was a simple question, but it hit him harder than he expected. Where was he going? Back to his normal life, hauling freight across dangerous roads for men who didn't care if he lived or died? Back to lonely camps under empty skies, working himself to exhaustion so he didn't have to think about all the things he'd lost? He looked at Iris's face, at the hope there mixed with fear. She'd already been abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. He wouldn't add his name to that list. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'll make sure you're settled first, all of you. She nodded, satisfied with that answer, and settled back into the wagon. They reached Sentinel Station just after dark. It was a small settlement built around a water depot. A dozen buildings clustered along the rail line, serving as a resupply point for trains and travelers. The marshal's office was a sturdy adobe building with bars on the windows and a holding cell in the back. As they pulled up, Ethan could see Hayes and Keller through the barred window, their faces pressed against the glass. Hayes's shoulder was bandaged, and he looked pale and frightened. Keller just looked angry. Beckett dismounted and helped unload the children, carrying them one by one into the office where Dr. Patterson had set up a temporary infirmary. The local women had heard what happened and arrived with blankets, soup, and clean clothes. Within an hour, the children were bathed, fed, and sleeping on cots arranged in the marshal's front office. Ethan stood in the doorway watching them, his body aching with exhaustion but his mind still racing. Iris was the last one awake, her eyes following him as he moved. You should sleep, he said quietly. So should you. He couldn't argue with that. One of the local families had offered him a room for the night, but he found himself reluctant to leave, as if his presence somehow kept the children safer, even though they were surrounded by law and community now. Beckett appeared at his elbow with 2 cups of coffee. "Come on, let the doc do his job. You need rest." They sat on the office porch, watching the desert night settle around them. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air finally cool after the brutal heat of the day. "I wired Tucson," Beckett said. "The orphanage will send someone to collect the children in a few days, once Patterson says they're strong enough to travel. And the investigation? I've got Hayes and Keller dead to rights on kidnapping and attempted murder. They'll hang for it. As for Garrett," Beckett took a long drink of coffee, "I sent telegrams to every marshal and sheriff within 200 miles. Put out a warrant for his arrest, but he's got resources. If he's smart, he's already on a train to California or Mexico. And if he's not smart, then maybe we'll get lucky." They sat in silence for a while. Then Beckett said, "You ever think about doing something other than freight hauling?" Ethan looked at him. "Like what?" "Territory needs good men, deputies who aren't afraid to do the hard work. Pay's not great, but it's steady, and you'd be making a difference." "I'm not a lawman." "You stood between armed men and a wagon full of dying children. You pulled the dead ones out and built cairns over them. You drove through the night with no water and no guarantee you'd make it." Beckett met his eyes. "Son, you're more of a lawman than half the badge carriers I know." Ethan wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. He thought about the moment he'd drawn his pistol on Garrett's men, the clarity that had settled over him. He'd been terrified, but he'd also been certain. For the first time in years, he'd known exactly what he needed to do. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Beckett smiled. "That's all I'm asking." The next 3 days passed in a blur. Dr. Patterson kept the children under observation, treating their dehydration and malnutrition with careful precision. Slowly, color returned to their faces. They began to talk more, to move around, to act like children again instead of broken survivors. Iris stayed close to Ethan whenever he visited. She didn't say much, just sat beside him while he told stories about his years on the freight roads. He found himself editing the stories as he went, taking out the loneliness and the danger, focusing instead on the beauty of the desert sunsets and the satisfaction of a hard job well done. On the 4th day, a telegram arrived from Phoenix. Samuel Garrett had been arrested trying to board a train to San Francisco. The authorities had found records in his office, ledgers documenting every child bought and sold over the past 6 years. Over 200 names, most of them marked as delivered, some marked as lost in transit. Ethan was with Beckett when the telegram came through. The marshal read it twice, then handed it to Ethan without a word. "He's going to trial," Ethan said slowly. "Federal court. With this kind of evidence, he won't walk. They'll convict him, and they'll hang him." Beckett leaned back in his chair. "It's over, Cole. You stopped him. You saved those kids, and you brought down a monster." But Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt tired and sad and angry about all the children who hadn't made it. Thomas and Mary and the 11 in the desert, and who knew how many others scattered across the territory, their names in Garrett's ledger beside the words "lost in transit." "It's not enough," he said. "It never is," Beckett agreed, "but it's what we've got." On the 5th day, the wagon from Tucson arrived. Sister Catherine was a tall woman with kind eyes and hands that had clearly done hard work. She examined each child personally, speaking to them in soft tones, learning their names and their stories. When she reached Iris, she knelt down to the girl's eye level. "You must be the one who kept everyone together, the brave one." Iris shook her head. "I wasn't brave. I was just scared." "Being brave doesn't mean not being scared, child. It means being scared and doing what needs to be done anyway." Sister Catherine stood and looked at Ethan. "I understand we have you to thank for these children's lives." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Sister Catherine said firmly. "You did what a good man would do, and there aren't as many of those as there should be." The children were loaded into the wagon for the journey to Tucson. They'd gained weight in the past few days, and the haunted look had faded from their eyes. They chattered nervously as they climbed aboard, excited and frightened about what came next. Iris was the last one to get in. She stood in front of Ethan, looking up at him with those ancient eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for not leaving us." Ethan knelt down so they were face to face. "Iris, you're the bravest person I've ever met. Don't let anyone tell you different." She hugged him suddenly, fiercely, her thin arms tight around his neck. He held her carefully, this small, fierce survivor, and felt something shift in his chest, like a door opening to let light into a dark room. "Will you come visit?" she asked when she pulled back. "I will," he promised, and meant it. He watched the wagon roll away until it disappeared into the heat shimmer on the horizon. Beckett stood beside him, quiet and patient. "So," the marshal said eventually, "you make a decision?" Ethan thought about the past week, about finding those children and choosing to stop, about standing against armed men and driving through the night with no guarantee of success, about Iris's courage and Thomas's death and Mary's small body wrapped in canvas. He thought about going back to his old life, hauling freight across empty roads, sleeping under empty skies, working himself numb so he didn't have to feel anything. And he thought about Sister Catherine's words. "You did what a good man would do." Maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. "Yeah," he said. "I made a decision." Beckett smiled. "Good, because I've got a job for you if you want it. There's word of another operation running out of Santa Fe, same setup as Garrett's. Someone needs to investigate." Ethan looked at him, seeing the challenge and the invitation in the old lawman's eyes. This was what came next. Not rest, not peace, just more work, more danger, more children who needed someone willing to stand between them and the monsters. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Ethan felt like maybe he was built for this. Maybe all the hard miles and the lonely years had been preparing him for something that mattered. "All right," he said. "Tell me about Santa Fe." Beckett spread a map across his desk, his finger tracing the line from Sentinel Station north to Santa Fe. The distance was considerable, nearly 400 miles through some of the roughest country in the territory. 3 weeks ago, a priest named Father Dominguez sent a letter to the territorial governor, Beckett said. He runs an orphanage outside Santa Fe, small operation funded by the church. According to him, a man's been coming around every few months offering to place children with families. Same story as Garrett, good homes, loving parents, fresh starts. But Dominguez got suspicious when none of the children ever wrote back. Ethan studied the map, his jaw tight. How many children? 47 over the past 2 years, all signed over legal and proper with documents filed at the courthouse. On paper, everything looks legitimate. But it's not. Dominguez doesn't think so, and after what we found in Garrett's ledgers, neither do I. Beckett pulled out a stack of papers covered in cramped handwriting. Garrett kept records of everyone he did business with. Names, locations, amounts paid. There's a notation here about Santa Fe, regular shipments, premium prices. Someone up north is buying children, and whoever's running the operation knows how to make it look legal. Ethan felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he'd first seen that abandoned wagon in the desert. You want me to go to Santa Fe and find out who? I want you to go to Santa Fe and shut it down. Beckett met his eyes. I can't leave my jurisdiction, and by the time I get authorization from the territorial marshal, whoever's running this operation will hear about Garrett's arrest and disappear. But you're not official. You're just a freight hauler passing through, asking questions. Nobody will see you coming. I'm not a detective, Beckett. No, you're better. You're a man who gives a damn. The marshal pushed a leather folder across the desk. There's a deputy's badge in there, and papers authorizing you to act on behalf of the territorial marshal's office. Wear the badge or don't. It's your choice. But if you find something, you'll have the authority to make arrests. Ethan opened the folder and stared at the silver star inside. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with responsibility and expectation. He thought about Iris's face when she'd hugged him goodbye, and Thomas's small body wrapped in canvas, and the 11 cairns scattered in the desert. He pinned the badge inside his vest, where it wouldn't show, and closed the folder. When do I leave? Soon as you're ready, I'll wire Father Dominguez and let him know you're coming. Beckett stood and offered his hand. Be careful, Cole. Garrett had money and connections, but he was careless. Whoever's running the Santa Fe operation has stayed hidden for 2 years. That takes planning and discipline. They won't go down easy. Ethan shook his hand. Neither will I. He left Sentinel Station the next morning on a fresh horse, a sturdy buckskin mare the marshal's office provided, with Greta following on a lead line. His freight business could wait. Right now, he had more important cargo to deliver, justice for children who'd been treated as merchandise. The ride north took him through changing country. The bare desert gave way to rolling grasslands, then to pine forests that climbed the slopes of distant mountains. The air grew cooler, the sky deeper blue. He passed through small settlements where people eyed him with suspicion, and larger towns where the law was either absent or bought. He kept his head down, his badge hidden, and asked no questions that would draw attention. Santa Fe appeared on the horizon on the 14th day, adobe buildings climbing the hillsides in golden tiers, church towers reaching toward the cloudless sky. It was older than most territorial towns, with Spanish architecture and narrow streets that spoke of a different era. Ethan rode through the plaza slowly, taking in the merchants and traders, the well-dressed shoppers and ragged beggars, the mixture of cultures that made the city feel both foreign and familiar. The orphanage sat on the eastern edge of town, a long, low building surrounded by a courtyard wall. Ethan could hear children's voices as he approached, high and bright with laughter. It was a sound that made his chest ache after everything he'd seen. Father Dominguez met him at the gate, a compact man in his 60s with weathered brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. He studied Ethan carefully before speaking. "You're the one Marshal Beckett sent." "Ethan Cole." "You don't look like a lawman." "I'm not really." Ethan showed him the badge hidden in his vest. "I'm just someone who doesn't like seeing children hurt." Something in the priest's expression softened. "Then you're exactly the kind of lawman we need. Come inside." The orphanage was clean but spare, with whitewashed walls and simple furniture. 20 children of various ages moved through the courtyard, playing games or doing chores under the watchful eyes of 2 elderly nuns. They looked healthy and cared for, nothing like the hollow-eyed survivors Ethan had pulled from the desert wagon. Dominguez led him to a small office and closed the door. "I wrote to the governor 6 weeks ago," he said without preamble. "I've heard nothing back. Either my letter didn't arrive, or nobody cares about missing orphans. Or someone made sure it got buried," Ethan suggested. The priest nodded grimly. "That's what I'm afraid of. The man who comes here, his name is Reynolds, Thomas Reynolds. He has documents from the territorial court authorizing him to place orphans with approved families. Everything looks legitimate. The first few times he came, I thought it was a blessing. Then I started noticing things." "What kind of things?" "He only takes certain children, the older ones, 12 and up, the ones who can work. And he's very particular about their appearance. He examines them like livestock, checking their teeth, their hands, asking how strong they are." Dominguez's voice hardened. "And none of them ever write back. I give each child a letter with my address, tell them to send word once they're settled. In 2 years, I haven't received a single letter." Ethan felt ice forming in his gut. "When was Reynolds last here?" 3 weeks ago. He took 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Said he had families waiting in Colorado." "Do you have their names?" Dominguez pulled out a ledger and opened it to a marked page. 4 names were written in careful script, along with dates and destinations. Miguel Santos, age 14. Anna Chen, age 13. Robert Taylor, age 15. Carmen Rodriguez, age 12. "These families Reynolds mentioned," Ethan said. "Did he give you their names? Addresses?" "General locations only, Durango, Pueblo, Colorado Springs. He said the families valued their privacy." The priest's expression was bitter. "I believed him. God forgive me, I believed him, and I let those children go." "You didn't know. And beating yourself up won't help them now." Ethan studied the ledger. "What about the courthouse documents? Can I see them?" Dominguez produced a folder of official-looking papers, each one stamped with the seal of the territorial court and signed by a Judge Harlan Westfield. The language was formal and legal, authorizing Thomas Reynolds to act as an agent for the territorial orphan placement program. Ethan had seen enough legal documents to know these looked genuine. But so had Garrett's operation, and that had been nothing but a slave market dressed in respectable clothes. "I need to see Judge Westfield," he said. "That might be difficult. He's a powerful man in Santa Fe, with connections to the governor's office." Dominguez hesitated. "If he's involved in this, approaching him directly could be dangerous." "Then I'll be careful." Ethan stood. "In the meantime, if Reynolds comes back, delay him. Find excuses. Tell him the children are sick. Tell him you need more time. Tell him anything. Just don't let him take anyone else." "And if he insists?" Ethan's hand rested on his hidden badge. "Send for me immediately. I'll be at the hotel on the plaza." He spent the next 2 days moving carefully through Santa Fe's legal and social circles, asking questions that seemed innocent but were designed to build a picture of Judge Westfield and Thomas Reynolds. What he learned wasn't encouraging. Westfield had been on the bench for 15 years, respected and feared in equal measure. He owned property throughout the territory, sat on the boards of multiple businesses, and counted senators and railroad magnates among his friends. If he was involved in child trafficking, he'd covered his tracks well. Reynolds was harder to pin down. He appeared in Santa Fe every few months, always well-dressed and courteous, always carrying documents from the court. He stayed at the finest hotel, ate at the best restaurants, and never caused trouble. Between visits, he vanished completely, leaving no forwarding address. On the third day, Ethan found something useful. A clerk at the courthouse, a nervous young man named Peters, agreed to meet him in a quiet cantina after dark. "I could lose my position for this," Peters said, his hands shaking around his whiskey glass. "Judge Westfield doesn't tolerate disloyalty." "I'm not asking you to be disloyal. I'm asking you to help children who can't help themselves." Ethan pushed a gold coin across the table. "Tell me about the orphan placement program." Peters stared at the coin, then pocketed it quickly. "It's legitimate, as far as I know. The territorial government established it 5 years ago to address the orphan problem. Judges can authorize agents to place children with suitable families. It's supposed to be carefully regulated with background checks and home visits. But it's not. Not in practice, no. The territory's too big, resources too limited. Mostly the judges just sign the papers and trust the agents to do the right thing." "And Judge Westfield?" Peters swallowed hard. "He signs more placement orders than any other judge in the territory. Dozens every year. I've always thought it was because he cared about the orphans, that he was trying to help. But lately," he trailed off. "What changed?" "I started noticing patterns. The children placed through Westfield's orders. They're always older, always healthy. And the families receiving them, they're not in the main towns. They're in remote locations, mining camps, ranches in the middle of nowhere. Places where nobody asks questions." Ethan leaned forward. "Do you have records of these placements?" "Not with me. They're locked in Westfield's private files." "But I've seen them." Peter's voice dropped to a whisper. "There's another pattern, too. Most of the children are foreign-born or mixed race, Chinese, Mexican, Indian, the kind of children nobody notices when they disappear." The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that made Ethan's blood boil. This wasn't just trafficking, it was systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable children in the territory, hidden behind legal documents and the authority of the court. "I need those files," Ethan said. "Impossible. They're in Westfield's office, and he keeps it locked. Only he and his clerk have keys." "Who's his clerk?" "Man named Sutton. He's loyal to Westfield, been with him for years. You won't get anything from him." Ethan sat back, thinking. A frontal approach wouldn't work. Westfield was too powerful, too well protected. But there were other ways to get information, ways that didn't require cooperation from corrupt clerks. "When does Westfield usually leave his office?" 6 o'clock, like clockwork. He goes home for dinner, comes back around 8 to work late." "And Sutton?" "Leaves when the judge does, returns with him." A 2-hour window. Not much, but it might be enough. Ethan left the cantina and walked through the dark streets, his mind working through the logistics. Breaking into a judge's office was a crime that could land him in prison, or worse. But letting children disappear into slavery was a crime that damned the soul. He knew which one he could live with. The next evening, he positioned himself across from the courthouse with a clear view of the entrance. At 6 o'clock precisely, Judge Westfield emerged. A tall man with silver hair and expensive clothes, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never been challenged. Sutton followed a few steps behind, carrying a leather case. Ethan waited 30 minutes to be sure they weren't coming back, then approached the courthouse. It was a 3-story stone building with barred windows and heavy doors. The main entrance was locked, but he'd spotted a side door earlier that looked less secure. He picked the lock with tools he'd learned to use during his freight hauling days. Sometimes you needed to get into your own cargo when keys went missing, and slipped inside. The building was silent, empty except for the echo of his footsteps on the marble floors. Westfield's office was on the 2nd floor, marked with a brass nameplate. The door was locked, but it was old wood with simple mechanism. Ethan had it open in less than a minute. The office was exactly what he'd expected: leather furniture, expensive rugs, shelves lined with law books. A massive desk dominated the room, its surface clear except for an oil lamp and a pen set. Behind the desk, a large cabinet with locked drawers. Ethan lit the lamp and went to work on the cabinet. The lock was better quality than the door, but his tools were good and his motivation was better. After 5 minutes of careful manipulation, the drawer slid open. Inside were files arranged alphabetically, each one containing placement orders and related documents. Ethan pulled out several at random and spread them on the desk. What he found made his stomach turn. The pattern Peters had described was even clearer in the original documents: child after child placed with families in remote locations, mining operations, logging camps, isolated ranches. Most of the receiving families had Spanish names, but the addresses were vague, often just care of some company or foreman. And there were notes in the margins, handwritten in what Ethan assumed was Westfield's script. Numbers. Dollar amounts. Next to each child's name, a price. Miguel Santos, $75. Anna Chen, $65. Robert Taylor, $80. They weren't placement fees. They were purchase prices. Ethan photographed as many documents as he could with the small camera he'd borrowed from Beckett, working quickly and methodically. He was almost finished when he heard footsteps in the hallway outside. He froze, his heart hammering. The footsteps came closer, then stopped right outside the door. Ethan carefully closed the drawer and extinguished the lamp, moving silently to the corner behind the door. A key rattled in the lock. The door swung open, and Sutton entered, carrying the same leather case. He walked to the desk without looking around and set the case down, then reached for the lamp. Ethan stepped out behind him and pressed his pistol against the clerk's spine. "Don't move. Don't make a sound." Sutton went rigid, his hand frozen halfway to the lamp. "Who?" "I said don't make a sound." Ethan's voice was quiet and hard. "I'm going to ask you questions, and you're going to answer them truthfully. If you lie, I'll know. And if you scream, you won't like what happens next. Understand?" The clerk nodded jerkily. "Where are the children placed through Judge Westfield's orders actually going?" Sutton's breathing was rapid and shallow. "I don't know what you mean. They go to the families listed in the documents." Ethan pressed the pistol harder. "I told you not to lie. I've seen the files. I've seen the prices written next to their names." "Where are they going?" Sutton's resistance crumbled. "Mining camps, ranches, factories, anywhere someone needs cheap labor and doesn't ask questions." "And Reynolds? He's the broker. He finds the buyers, makes the arrangements, delivers the children. Judge Westfield provides the legal cover, makes it all look legitimate." "How long has this been going on?" 5 years, maybe longer. I've only been involved for 3. Ethan felt sick. 5 years of children disappearing into slavery, all under the cover of legal adoption. "How many?" "I don't know exactly. Hundreds." "And nobody noticed? Nobody questioned it?" "Some people tried. Priests, teachers, a few concerned citizens. But Westfield has connections. Complaints get buried. Witnesses disappear. After a while, people learn not to ask questions." Sutton's voice shook. "Please, I'm just a clerk. I just file the papers. I don't hurt anyone." "You enable it. That makes you complicit." Ethan grabbed the man's collar and spun him around. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to write down everything you know: names, locations, dates, amounts, every detail. And then you're going to sign it and swear to its truth." "Westfield will kill me." "Westfield's going to hang. The only question is whether you hang with him or testify against him." Ethan released the clerk and stepped back. "Choose carefully." Sutton stared at him for a long moment, his face pale and sweating. Then he sat down at the desk and pulled out paper and pen. It took him an hour to write everything down, his hand cramped and shaking. When he finished, the confession was 15 pages long, detailing every placement order, every payment, every child sold into servitude. Sutton signed it at the bottom and dated it. Ethan read it through carefully, then folded it and put it inside his vest. "Where's Reynolds now?" "I don't know. He comes and goes. Sometimes we don't see him for months." "When's he due back?" "Soon. He usually comes every 6 weeks, and it's been almost that long since his last visit." Ethan considered this. If Reynolds was coming back to Santa Fe, that gave him an opportunity to catch the broker and the judge together, to shut down the entire operation at once. But timing would be critical. "You're going to send word to Father Dominguez the moment Reynolds arrives in town," Ethan said, "and you're not going to tell anyone about this conversation. If Westfield finds out I was here, I'll make sure your confession reaches every newspaper in the territory before they kill me. Understand?" Sutton nodded miserably. Ethan left the courthouse the same way he'd entered, slipping into the night with the confession burning against his chest. He'd gotten what he came for, proof of the conspiracy, documented and signed. But proof alone wouldn't save the children who were already gone, scattered across the territory in places where the law couldn't or wouldn't reach them. He needed to do more. He needed to find them and bring them back. The next morning, Ethan returned to the orphanage and showed Father Dominguez the confession. The priest read it in silence, his face growing darker with each page. "Dear God," he whispered when he finished, "I trusted them. I let them take those children because I trusted the law." "The law failed them," Ethan said. "Now we have to make it right." "How?" "These children are scattered across hundreds of miles. Even if we found them all, it would take months." "Then we start with the ones we can reach." Ethan pulled out a map and spread it on the desk. According to Sutton's confession, the 4 children Reynolds took 3 weeks ago were sent to a mining operation near Durango. That's a week's ride from here. If we move fast, we might reach them before they're moved again. Dominguez looked at him with something like hope. "You'd do that? Go after them yourself?" "I'm not doing this alone. You're coming with me." "I'm an old man. I can't." "You know these children. You can identify them. Tell them they're safe. That matters more than a strong back or a fast gun." Ethan met the priest's eyes. "Besides, I need a witness. Someone who can testify that the children were found in conditions that match Sutton's confession. Your word carries weight. Mine doesn't." Dominguez was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and removed his cassock, hanging it carefully on a peg by the door. Underneath, he wore simple traveling clothes. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning. We'll need supplies for a 2-week journey and horses that can handle mountain trails." "I'll make arrangements." The priest paused. "What about Westfield and Reynolds? If we leave town, they might disappear." "I've got someone watching the courthouse. The moment Reynolds shows up, I'll get word." Ethan touched the confession in his vest. "And when we come back with those children, we'll have everything we need to put both of them in front of a judge who isn't corrupt." They left Santa Fe at dawn, riding north through country that grew steadily rougher. The road climbed into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, winding through pine forests and across high meadows where early snow still lingered in the shadows. Dominguez rode well for an older man, keeping pace without complaint despite the long hours in the saddle. On the 3rd day, they passed through a small settlement where Ethan stopped to ask questions. The locals were suspicious at first, but money loosened tongues. Yes, they'd seen children come through a few weeks back. 4 of them, traveling with a well-dressed man who said he was taking them to their new families. The children had looked scared, but nobody had interfered. People minded their own business in these mountains. The mining operation sat in a narrow valley carved by a fast-running creek. From their vantage point on the ridge above, Ethan could see the whole layout: rough barracks, a mess hall, the dark mouths of mine shafts carved into the hillside. Men moved between the buildings, and the sound of picks striking stone echoed across the valley. "I don't see any children," Dominguez said, his voice tight with worry. "They're probably underground. Easier to hide them that way." Ethan studied the camp through his field glasses. "We'll wait until dark, then go in quiet. Find the children, get them out, and be gone before anyone knows we were there." And if we're caught? Ethan showed him the badge inside his vest. Then I arrest whoever tries to stop us, and we ride out anyway. They spent the afternoon concealed in the trees, watching the camp's routine. The miners worked in shifts, disappearing into the shafts for hours before emerging covered in dust and exhaustion. A foreman walked the grounds with a rifle, making sure nobody slacked off. It was a hard place, the kind where men were worked until they broke and then replaced. As the sun set and lamps were lit in the barracks, Ethan saw what he'd been waiting for. A door at the back of one building opened, and a small figure emerged carrying a bucket. Even from a distance, Ethan recognized the way the child moved, careful, frightened, trying to be invisible. "There," he said quietly. "That's one of them." Dominguez looked through the glasses and made a sound of anguish. "That's Miguel. Dear God, what have they done to him?" They waited until full dark, then made their way down to the camp on foot, moving silently through the shadows. The barracks where they'd seen Miguel was slightly apart from the main buildings, close to the creek. A single lamp burned in the window. Ethan approached the door and listened. He could hear children's voices inside, speaking Spanish in hushed tones. He knocked quietly, 3 soft taps. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached, and the door cracked open. A girl's face appeared in the gap, her eyes wide and terrified. "Anna Chen?" Ethan whispered. She nodded, too frightened to speak. "I'm Ethan Cole. Father Dominguez sent me to bring you home." The priest stepped forward into the lamplight, and Anna's expression crumbled into relief and disbelief. She pulled the door open, and Ethan saw the room beyond, 4 children huddled in the small space, their clothes ragged, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. Miguel stood when he saw Dominguez, his lips trembling. "Father? It's all right, mijo. You're safe now. We're taking you home." The children gathered their few possessions, almost nothing, just the clothes on their backs, and followed Ethan and Dominguez into the night. They moved quickly and quietly, staying close to the creek where the sound of running water would cover their footsteps. They were almost to the trees when a voice called out behind them. "Hey, who's there?" Ethan turned to see the foreman standing by the barracks, his rifle in his hands. The man raised the weapon, and lamplight glinted off the barrel. "Run!" Ethan shouted to Dominguez. "Get them to the horses!" The priest grabbed the children and fled into the darkness. Ethan drew his pistol and fired once over the foreman's head. The man dove for cover, shouting for help. Lamps blazed to life across the camp. Men poured out of the barracks, confused and angry. Ethan fired twice more to keep them back, then turned and ran after Dominguez and the children. He reached the ridge where they'd left the horses to find the priest already lifting children into saddles. Ethan grabbed Miguel and swung him up behind Dominguez, then mounted his own horse with Anna holding tight to his waist. "Go!" he shouted, spurring his horse forward. They crashed through the forest in the darkness, branches whipping their faces, the horses stumbling over unseen obstacles. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Ethan knew it was only temporary. Once the foreman organized his men, they'd come after them with dogs and guns and murder in their hearts. They rode through the night without stopping, putting as much distance between themselves and the mining camp as possible. By dawn, they'd covered 20 miles, and the children were falling asleep in their saddles despite the fear and the cold. Ethan called a halt in a sheltered canyon where a spring provided fresh water. While Dominguez tended to the children, Ethan climbed to a high point and watched their back trail. No sign of pursuit yet, but that didn't mean they were safe. When he returned to camp, he found the children wrapped in blankets, eating hardtack and dried meat. They looked marginally better than they had in the barracks, but their eyes still held that terrible haunted quality he'd seen in Iris and the others. "Tell me what happened," he said gently, sitting down beside them. Miguel spoke first, his voice flat and emotionless. "Mr. Reynolds came to the orphanage and said he had a family for us. A rancher in Colorado who needed help with his land. He said we'd have our own rooms and good food and people who cared about us." "But it was a lie," Anna continued. "When we got to Durango, there was no family, just men who grabbed us and threw us in a wagon. They brought us to that camp and put us to work in the mines. 12 hours a day, every day. If we were slow, they hit us. If we complained, they locked us in the dark." Robert and Carmen nodded, their faces etched with remembered terror. They were only children, but their innocence had been burned away by cruelty and broken promises. Ethan felt rage building in his chest, hot and righteous. This was what Westfield and Reynolds had created, a machine that ground up children and spit out broken shells. And it had been running for 5 years, destroying hundreds of lives while the law looked the other way. "You're safe now," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "We're taking you back to Santa Fe, and then we're going to make sure the men who did this pay for it." "Will you really?" Miguel asked, his voice carrying a terrible skepticism. "Or will they just do it to other children?" Ethan met the boy's eyes and saw an accusation there, a challenge. This child had learned that adults couldn't be trusted, that the world was cruel and promises were lies. Changing that belief would take more than words. "I'll really," Ethan said quietly. "I swear it on my life." They rested for 2 hours, then pressed on, following trails that wound through the mountains toward Santa Fe. The journey back took longer than the trip out. The children couldn't ride as hard, and Ethan took detours to avoid settlements where they might be recognized. On the 5th day, a rider intercepted them on the trail. Ethan's hand went to his pistol, but he relaxed when he recognized the man as one of Beckett's deputies from Sentinel Station. "Message from Santa Fe," the deputy said, handing over a sealed envelope. "Father's assistant sent it express, said it was urgent." Ethan tore open the envelope and read the brief note inside. His expression darkened with each word. "What is it?" Dominguez asked. "Reynolds is in Santa Fe. Arrived 2 days ago with new placement orders." Ethan crushed the paper in his fist. "He's at the orphanage right now, selecting more children." The priest went pale. "We have to stop him." "We will." Ethan turned to the deputy. "How fast can you ride back to Sentinel?" 2 days if I push hard." "Do it. Tell Marshal Beckett I need every lawman he can spare sent to Santa Fe immediately. Tell him to bring federal marshals if he can get them. This is bigger than a local arrest. We're taking down a territorial judge." The deputy nodded and wheeled his horse around, disappearing down the trail at a gallop. Ethan looked at the 4 exhausted children, then at Dominguez. They were still 3 days from Santa Fe, maybe 2 if they pushed dangerously hard. And every hour they delayed gave Reynolds more time to take children who might disappear forever. "Can they ride hard?" he asked the priest. Dominguez looked at Miguel, Ana, Robert, and Carmen. 4 children who'd already been through hell, who'd earned the right to rest in safety. But 4 children who also understood what was at stake. Miguel straightened in his saddle. "We can ride!" So they did, pushing through exhaustion and fear, racing against time and evil. The horses were lathered and stumbling by the time Santa Fe appeared on the horizon, but they made it in 2 days instead of 3. Ethan rode straight to the orphanage, where he found chaos. Sister Magdalena, one of the elderly nuns, met him at the gate with tears streaming down her face. "He took them," she said brokenly. "Reynolds took them. Father Dominguez's assistant tried to delay him, but Reynolds had his documents, and the judge's authority, and we couldn't—" "How many?" Ethan's voice was hard. 6. All older children, all healthy. Her hands twisted in her habit. "He left an hour ago, heading north." Ethan looked at Dominguez, seeing his own rage and helplessness reflected in the priest's face. They'd come so far, saved 4 children, gathered evidence that could bring down the entire operation, and they were still too late. But maybe not too late to stop it. "Get these children inside," Ethan said, dismounting. "Feed them, clean them up, keep them safe, and when the marshals arrive, tell them everything." "Where are you going?" Dominguez asked. Ethan checked his pistol, then swung back into his saddle despite his horse's exhausted protest. "To finish this." He rode north alone, following the tracks of Reynolds' wagon through the gathering dusk. His horse was nearly done, but he pushed her anyway, driven by fury and determination. Somewhere ahead of him, 6 more children were being carried toward slavery. He couldn't save everyone. He couldn't undo 5 years of horror, but he could save these 6. He had to. The tracks led him off the main road and down a narrow trail that wound through broken country. As night fell, he saw a firelight ahead and the silhouette of a wagon parked beside a small stream. Ethan dismounted and approached on foot, moving silently through the darkness. He could hear Reynolds' voice, smooth and cultured, telling the children everything would be fine, that they'd reach their new families soon, that they just needed to be patient. The same lies. Always the same lies. Ethan stepped into the firelight with his pistol drawn. Reynolds looked up, surprise flashing across his face, before he composed himself into a pleasant smile. "Can I help you, friend?" "Thomas Reynolds, you're under arrest for kidnapping, trafficking, and conspiracy to commit slavery." Reynolds stood slowly, his hands visible and empty. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I'm a licensed placement agent working under the authority of Judge Westfield. These children are being legally transferred to approved families. Those documents are forgeries covering a slave trade, and I have a signed confession that proves it." Ethan gestured with his pistol. "Step away from the children." Reynolds' smile never wavered, but something changed in his eyes, something cold and calculating. "You're that freight hauler from the Sonoran, the one who interfered with Garrett's operation. We wondered if you'd show up." "Wondered or hoped?" "Both, actually. Killing you will tie up a loose end." Reynolds moved his hand slightly, and suddenly a derringer appeared in his palm, the small pistol aimed directly at Ethan's chest. Before either man could fire, a rock flew out of the darkness and struck Reynolds' hand. The derringer discharged harmlessly into the air, and Reynolds cursed, clutching his bruised fingers. Ethan spun to see Miguel standing at the edge of the firelight, his arm still extended from the throw. "You said you swore it on your life," the boy said simply. "I came to make sure you kept your word." More figures emerged from the darkness. Anna, Robert, Carmen, and Father Dominguez, all mounted on fresh horses from the orphanage. They'd followed him, refusing to let him face this alone. Reynolds looked at the growing crowd, and his confident smile finally cracked. He raised his hands slowly. "All right," he said. "All right. You win." Ethan approached carefully and kicked the derringer away, then searched Reynolds for other weapons. He found a knife, another pistol, and a money belt containing more cash than an honest placement agent should carry. "Where were you taking them?" Ethan demanded. Reynolds said nothing. Miguel stepped forward, his young face hard. "I know where. Same place they took us. The mining camp in Durango." "Not just there," Anna added quietly. "He was bragging while we rode. Said he had buyers all over the territory. Mines, ranches, factories, places that need workers who won't complain or run away." Ethan looked at the 6 terrified children sitting in Reynolds' wagon, seeing Iris and Thomas and Mary and all the others who hadn't made it, seeing every child who disappeared into darkness while men like Reynolds and Westfield profited. "It's over," he said to Reynolds. "The whole operation. Sutton confessed. The children you sold are being found. And when Westfield hears you've been arrested, he'll know his time is up too." "You think arresting us will change anything?" Reynolds laughed bitterly. "There will always be men like us and children nobody cares about. You can't save them all." "No," Ethan agreed, "but I can save enough." He bound Reynolds' hands and loaded him into the wagon with the children watching in silence. Then they all turned back toward Santa Fe, toward justice and safety, and the hope that sometimes, when good people stood up, evil could be stopped. The stars were bright overhead, and somewhere behind them, federal marshals were riding north with warrants and authority. The machinery of law was finally grinding into motion, slow but inexorable. And Ethan Cole, freight hauler turned lawman, rode beside a priest and 10 rescued children toward a reckoning that was 5 years overdue. They reached Santa Fe as the sun was climbing over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the adobe buildings gold and rose. Ethan's hands were numb from gripping the reins all night, his eyes gritty with exhaustion, but he kept Reynolds in his sight every moment. The man sat bound in the back of his own wagon, surrounded by the children he'd intended to sell, his expensive clothes dusty and his smooth confidence finally cracked. The orphanage courtyard was crowded when they arrived. Sister Magdalena stood at the gate with a dozen townspeople who'd gathered when word spread that children had been recovered. But it was the 3 men standing beside her that made Ethan's chest loosen with relief. Marshal Beckett had made good time from Sentinel Station, and he'd brought company. 2 federal marshals flanked him, their badges gleaming silver in the morning light, their faces hard with the kind of authority that didn't bend to local politics or corrupt judges. "Cole," Beckett called out as Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt. You've been busy. Found what I was looking for. Ethan climbed down stiffly and gestured to Reynolds. Thomas Reynolds, broker for a child trafficking operation running out of Judge Westfield's office. I've got a signed confession from Westfield's clerk, documented evidence of sales, and 10 children who can testify to where they were taken and what was done to them. The taller of the federal marshals stepped forward, his weathered face impassive. I'm Marshal Kane, Territorial Office. This is Marshal Vega. We received your deputy's message 2 days ago and came as fast as we could. His eyes moved to Reynolds, cold and assessing. We've also been investigating Judge Westfield for the past 6 months on suspicion of corruption. Your evidence might be exactly what we need to move against him. Reynolds' head snapped up. I want a lawyer. I'm not saying anything without legal counsel. You'll get your lawyer, Kane said flatly. Right after we search your belongings and interview these children. Marshal Vega, secure the prisoner. While Vega hauled Reynolds out of the wagon and into the orphanage, Ethan helped Father Dominguez lift the children down. They moved like old people, stiff and frightened, their eyes darting between the marshals and the gathering crowd. 6 more faces to add to the dozens Ethan already carried in his memory. Children who'd trusted adults and been betrayed, who'd learned too young that the world was cruel and promises were lies. Sister Magdalena gathered them into her arms, murmuring comfort in Spanish, while the other nuns brought water and bread. Miguel, Ana, Robert, and Carmen stayed close to Ethan, as if his presence was the only thing keeping them tethered to safety. They'll need statements from all of you, Kane said to Ethan and Dominguez. And from the children, when they're ready. We want every detail. Who took them, where they were held, what they were forced to do, who paid for them. They've been through enough, Dominguez said sharply. Can't this wait? Father, I understand your concern, but if we're going to prosecute Westfield and everyone involved in this operation, we need testimony that will hold up in federal court. The sooner we get it, the better. Kane's expression softened slightly. We'll be gentle, and we'll make sure they know they're safe. Ethan looked at the children, seeing the exhaustion and trauma written in every line of their small bodies. Give them today to rest. Tomorrow's soon enough for statements. Kane considered this, then nodded. Tomorrow morning, then. In the meantime, I need that confession you mentioned and any other evidence you've gathered. Ethan reached into his vest and pulled out Sutton's 15-page confession along with the photographs he'd taken of Westfield's files. Kane's eyes widened as he read through the documents, his jaw tightening with each page. This is damning, he said quietly. Dates, amounts, locations? If even half of this is true, Westfield's been running the largest trafficking operation in the territory. He looked up at Ethan. Where's Sutton now? Still in Santa Fe as far as I know, working in Westfield's office like nothing's happened. Not for long, Kane turned to Vega. Get the local sheriff and 3 deputies you trust. We're arresting Judge Westfield within the hour. Vega's eyebrows rose. You want to move that fast? Westfield's got friends in high places. We should coordinate with the territorial governor, make sure we have political cover. The moment Westfield hears Reynolds has been arrested, he'll run or destroy evidence. We move now. Kane's voice carried absolute authority. And I'll deal with the political fallout myself. They left Beckett at the orphanage to guard Reynolds while Kane and Vega gathered their arrest team. Ethan rode with them through Santa Fe's waking streets, past merchants opening their shops and women carrying water from the public wells. Normal life continuing while they rode to arrest a man who'd sent hundreds of children into darkness. The courthouse was just opening when they arrived, the clerk, a different man than Sutton, unlocking the main doors. Kane pushed past him without explanation and climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, Ethan and the other lawmen following close behind. Westfield's office door was closed but unlocked. Kane shoved it open without knocking and strode inside. Judge Harlan Westfield looked up from his desk with an expression of dignified annoyance that transformed to shock when he saw the federal badges. He was exactly as Ethan had glimpsed him days ago, tall and silver-haired, wearing expensive clothes and the confidence of a man who'd never been challenged. What is the meaning of this intrusion? Westfield demanded, rising to his feet. I'm a territorial judge. You can't just barge into my chambers. Judge Westfield, I'm Federal Marshal Kane. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit kidnapping, human trafficking, and corruption of public office. Kane's voice was flat and hard. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to legal counsel, and you're going to need both. Westfield's face went pale, then flushed with anger. This is outrageous. I don't know what you think you have, but I assure you I've committed no crime. My record is impeccable. Your record is fabricated. Kane pulled out Sutton's confession. Your clerk has provided a full accounting of your trafficking operation, including dates, amounts, and the names of every child you sold. We have photographic evidence of your files. And we have witnesses, children you intended to sell who are now safe and ready to testify against you. The color drained from Westfield's face. Sutton would never. That man is loyal. That man was terrified of hanging, so he chose cooperation. Kane nodded to Vega. Search this office. I want every document, every ledger, every scrap of paper that might contain evidence. As the marshals began pulling open drawers and cabinets, Westfield's composure finally shattered. You can't do this. Do you have any idea who I am? I have friends in the governor's office, in the legislature. One telegram from me and your careers are over. Make your telegram, Kane said coldly. I've been a federal marshal for 23 years, and I've arrested senators, railroad barons, and army generals. Your political connections don't scare me, and they won't save you. Westfield turned his fury on Ethan. You, the freight hauler. You did this. His voice shook with rage. I should have had Garrett kill you when I had the chance. Ethan stepped forward, his own anger finally breaking through the exhaustion. You should have thought about that before you started selling children. Every one of them had a name, a story, a life that mattered, and you treated them like livestock. They were orphans. Nobody wanted them. I gave them purpose, gave them work. You gave them slavery. Ethan's voice was quiet but cutting. You locked them in mines and factories, worked them until they broke. And when they died, you just bought more. And you did it all behind the authority of this court, using the law as a shield while you destroyed innocent lives. Westfield opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He looked around his office, at the marshals pulling out his carefully organized files, at the evidence of his crimes being laid bare, at the ruin of everything he'd built. Then he sank back into his chair, suddenly looking much older than his years. I want my lawyer, he said finally, his voice hollow. You'll get one, Kane said, right after we finish cataloging every piece of evidence in this office. They worked for 3 hours, building a case that would bury Westfield in his own documentation. The judge's files were meticulous. Every placement order, every payment received, every child's name and destination carefully recorded. It was the kind of evidence prosecutors dreamed about, a complete accounting of criminal enterprise laid out in the perpetrator's own handwriting. Ethan stood by the window watching Santa Fe's plaza while the marshals worked, his mind turning over everything that had happened since he'd found that wagon in the desert. Less than 3 weeks ago, he'd been a simple freight hauler with no connection to law enforcement and no particular desire to be a hero. Now he was standing in a judge's office watching federal marshals dismantle a trafficking network that had destroyed hundreds of lives. The weight of it was crushing. They'd won this battle. Westfield and Reynolds were in custody, the operation was shut down, the children were safe. But there were still dozens, maybe hundreds, of children scattered across the territory in places Ethan couldn't reach, children working in mines and factories and brothels, their childhoods stolen, their futures destroyed. Cole. He turned to find Kane standing beside him, holding a thick leather ledger. The marshal's expression was grim. This is Westfield's master record. Every child placed through his office over the past 6 years with names, ages, destinations, and purchase prices. Kane opened the book to show page after page of entries in neat handwriting. There are over 400 names here. Ethan felt sick. 400. And these are just the ones we know about. There could be more handled through other judges, other brokers. Kane closed the ledger carefully. We'll use this to track down as many children as we can. Federal marshals will raid every location listed here, arrest the buyers, recover the children. It's going to take months, maybe years, but we'll do it. What about the ones who aren't in that book? The ones who died or were sold to buyers who didn't keep records? Kane's jaw tightened. Those we may never find, but we'll try. and we'll make damn sure nothing like this happens again. They arrested Sutton that afternoon, pulling him from the courthouse in chains while shocked citizens watched. Word of Westfield's arrest had spread through Santa Fe like wildfire, and the plaza was packed with people demanding answers. Some defended the judge, insisting there must be some mistake. Others, particularly those in the Mexican and Chinese communities who'd lost children to the placement program, shouted for immediate justice. Kane addressed the crowd from the courthouse steps, his voice carrying across the plaza. Judge Harlan Westfield has been arrested on federal charges of human trafficking and corruption. Thomas Reynolds, his associate, is also in custody. We have evidence of a criminal conspiracy that resulted in hundreds of children being sold into slavery across the territory. Every child listed in Judge Westfield's records will be located and recovered. Every person who purchased or abused these children will be prosecuted. This I promise you on behalf of the federal government and the law we serve. The crowd erupted in shouts, some angry, some relieved, some simply stunned. Ethan watched from the courthouse window as Kane handled the chaos with calm authority, answering questions and promising transparency. This was what real law enforcement looked like when it worked. Not corrupt judges signing illegal orders, but honest men standing up for those who couldn't protect themselves. That evening, Ethan returned to the orphanage to find all 10 recovered children gathered in the courtyard with Father Dominguez. They looked better than they had that morning, cleaned up, fed, wearing fresh clothes donated by townspeople, but their eyes still held that haunted quality that might never fully fade. Miguel saw him first and stood up. The other children followed his lead, forming a small semicircle around Ethan. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Miguel said, "Father Dominguez told us what you did, how you broke into the courthouse and found the evidence, how you came after us when we were taken to the mining camp, how you arrested Reynolds and Westfield." The boy's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You saved us. You actually saved us." "We all saved each other," Ethan said quietly. "You were the ones brave enough to survive until help came. You were the ones who testified and told the truth even when it was hard. I just helped get you out." Anna stepped forward. "Will they really find all the other children, the ones in the ledger?" "The marshals will try. It won't be fast and it won't be easy. But yes, they'll try." "And Westfield?" Robert's voice was hard. "Will he hang?" "That's up to a jury. But with the evidence against him, I'd be surprised if he doesn't." Ethan looked at each child in turn. "What happened to you was evil and it was wrong. But it's over now. You're safe, and the men who hurt you are going to pay for what they did." Carmen, the youngest of the 4 from Durango, spoke for the first time since they'd been rescued. "What happens to us now?" It was the question Ethan had been dreading. These children had been ripped from everything familiar, forced into slavery, and then rescued by strangers. They had no families waiting for them, no homes to return to. The orphanage was safe, but it wasn't a solution, just a temporary shelter until something better could be found. Father Dominguez put his hand on Carmen's shoulder. "You stay here with us as long as you need. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. And when the time comes, we'll find real families for you. Not fake placements or false promises. Real homes with people who will love you and keep you safe." "How do we know they'll be real this time?" Miguel asked, and the skepticism in his voice cut like a knife. "How do we know the next person who comes won't be another Reynolds?" Dominguez looked at Ethan, silently asking for help with a question that had no easy answer. Ethan knelt down so he was at eye level with the children. "You don't know, not for certain, and I can't promise you'll never be hurt or disappointed again, because that's not how life works. But I can promise that people are watching now. The marshals know what Westfield did, and they're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I'm going to keep working with them to find the other children and shut down anyone else who tries this." "You're staying?" Iris's voice came from behind him. She'd arrived from Tucson that afternoon with Sister Catherine, brought north so she could testify at the trial. "You're going to be a lawman?" Ethan stood and turned to face her. She looked healthier than when he'd last seen her, more color in her face, less fear in her eyes. But she still carried herself with that careful wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Yeah," he said, making the decision as he spoke the words. "I'm staying." The next week passed in a blur of testimony and investigation. The federal marshals interviewed every child, carefully documenting their stories. Miguel described the mining camp in Durango, the 12-hour shifts underground, the beatings when they worked too slowly. Anna talked about the journey from Santa Fe, how Reynolds had been kind at first and then cruel once they were far from help. Robert and Carmen added their own details, filling in a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation. The 6 children Reynolds had been transporting when Ethan caught him told similar stories, promises of families and homes that dissolved into threats and violence once they were isolated. Their testimony was devastating, and even the hardened marshals looked shaken after hearing it. Ethan gave his own statement over 2 long days, walking Kane and Vega through everything from finding the wagon in the Sonoran Desert to breaking into Westfield's office. He handed over the photographs, explained how he'd gotten Sutton to confess, described the arrest of Reynolds. "You took a lot of risks," Kane observed when Ethan finished. "Breaking into a judge's chambers, coercing a confession, pursuing an armed suspect alone. Any of those could have gotten you killed or disbarred before you even got sworn in. I did what needed doing." "I know. And it worked, which is the only reason I'm not writing you up for procedural violations." Kane leaned back in his chair. "But if you're going to keep doing this work, you need to understand something. Law enforcement isn't about being a lone hero. It's about building cases that hold up in court, following procedures so evidence doesn't get thrown out, and working with other lawmen so nobody has to take on an entire criminal enterprise alone. Marshal Beckett already gave me this speech. Then maybe you should listen to it." Kane's expression softened slightly. "You're good at this work, Cole. You've got instincts and courage, and you actually care about the people you're protecting. But courage without discipline gets people killed. I'm offering to train you properly, teach you how to do this job right. You interested?" Ethan thought about it. He'd spent the past 3 weeks operating on instinct and anger, making decisions that could have easily gone wrong. He'd gotten lucky more than he'd gotten smart, and luck ran out eventually. "Yeah," he said finally. "I'm interested." "Good, because we're going to need all the help we can get." Kane pulled out a map covered in pencil marks. "Based on Westfield's ledger, we've identified 43 locations where children were sent. Mining camps, ranches, factories, even a few private homes. We're organizing raids, but it's a massive undertaking. Every marshal in the territory is involved, and we're still short-handed." "How many children are we talking about?" "At least 200 still unaccounted for. Some were placed years ago and may have aged out or died. Others were sold to buyers who moved frequently. We'll find what we can, but it's going to take time." Ethan studied the map, seeing the scope of what they were up against. The trafficking network had stretched across hundreds of miles, touching dozens of communities. Dismantling it would require coordinated effort, resources, and determination. "Where do you need me?" Kane pointed to a cluster of marks in southern Colorado. "There's a group of ranches near Trinidad that received multiple placements over the past 3 years. We think they're using the children as field labor, maybe worse. I want you and Beckett to investigate, see what you find, and report back. If the situation warrants it, we'll send a larger force to make arrests and recover the children." "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow. Trials for Westfield and Reynolds start in 2 weeks, and we need you back to testify. That gives you 12 days to get to Trinidad, investigate, and return." Ethan spent that evening at the orphanage, saying goodbye to the children who'd come to see him as their protector. It was harder than he'd expected, particularly with Iris, who'd attached herself to him like a shadow since arriving from Tucson. "You're coming back, right?" she asked for the 3rd time as they sat in the courtyard watching the sunset. "I'm coming back. I have to testify at the trial, remember? And after the trial? I'll still come back. This is where the work is, where the children are. I'm not going anywhere." She was quiet for a moment, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Miguel says we can't trust anyone. He says all adults lie. Miguel's been hurt badly, so it's hard for him to believe in people right now, but he's wrong. Not all adults lie. Some of them keep their promises." "Like you?" "Like me." Ethan put his arm around her thin shoulders. "And like Father Dominguez and Sister Catherine and the marshals who are working to find the other children. There are more good people than bad ones, Iris. It's just that the bad ones make more noise." She leaned against him, small and trusting in a way that made his chest ache. Will you write to me? When you're gone? Every week. I promise. Do you really promise, or is that what adults say when they don't mean it? Ethan thought about all the broken promises these children had endured, all the times adults had failed them or betrayed their trust. He understood why Iris needed more than casual words, why Miguel's skepticism cut so deep. They'd earned the right to doubt. I really promise, he said quietly, and if I break it, you have permission to track me down and call me a liar to my face. That got a small smile from her. I'd do it too. I know you would. You're the bravest person I know. He left Santa Fe at dawn with Marshal Beckett, riding north through country that grew steadily rougher. They traveled light and fast, pushing their horses hard but not cruelly, covering 40 miles a day through mountain passes and high valleys. Beckett used the time to teach Ethan the fundamentals of law enforcement, how to question witnesses without leading them, how to gather evidence that would hold up in court, how to recognize when a situation was about to turn violent. He was a patient teacher, never condescending, always willing to explain his reasoning. The thing people don't understand about this work, Beckett said as they made camp on the third night, is that it's mostly boring. For every dramatic arrest or shootout, there's 100 hours of paperwork and interviews and waiting for leads to develop. The hard part isn't having courage in a crisis. The hard part is having patience when nothing's happening. I'm not sure I'm cut out for patience, Ethan admitted. You'll learn, or you'll burn out fast. Beckett poured coffee from their battered pot. Can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Why are you doing this? You had a decent business hauling freight, made good money, answered to nobody. Now you're working for government wages, taking orders from marshals, and putting your life on the line for children you don't even know. What changed? Ethan stared into the fire, thinking about how to answer. I found that wagon in the desert, and I had a choice. I could ride past, report it when I reached civilization, and let someone else deal with it. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. But I stopped. And once I stopped, once I saw those children dying in that heat, I couldn't just walk away. A lot of men would have. I know, and maybe that's the problem. Ethan looked up at Beckett. For too long, I've been one of those men. Not cruel, not evil, just indifferent. Going through life focused on my own survival, my own business, not seeing the people around me who needed help. Finding that wagon woke me up. Made me realize that indifference is its own kind of evil. Beckett nodded slowly. You're going to be a good lawman, Cole. Better than most. They reached Trinidad on the 6th day and checked into a modest boarding house under false names. The town was a rough mining settlement perched on the edge of the Rockies, a place where men came to make money and didn't ask many questions. Perfect territory for people who wanted to exploit cheap labor without oversight. The ranches they were investigating sat in a valley 20 miles south of town, accessible only by a single rough road. According to Westfield's ledger, 18 children had been sent there over the past 3 years, all purchased by a man named Dalton Reese, who ran a cattle operation. Ethan and Beckett spent 2 days gathering information in Trinidad's saloons and trading posts, listening to gossip and asking casual questions. What they learned wasn't encouraging. Reese was known as a hard man who worked his hands brutally and didn't tolerate complaints. He'd been investigated twice for mistreating workers, but nothing had come of it. Witnesses disappeared or changed their stories, and Reese had enough money to make problems go away. Children working his ranch wouldn't be unusual, Beckett said, as they prepared to ride out. Lots of operations use kid labor for light work, but 18 children all purchased through Westfield's network? That's not coincidence. They approached the ranch at dusk, leaving their horses a mile away and continuing on foot through rough terrain. The ranch buildings appeared as they crested a ridge, a main house, several barracks, corrals, and a large barn. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and men moved between buildings carrying tools and equipment. And there, near the barn, Ethan saw what he'd been looking for. A group of small figures working in the fading light, hauling water buckets and stacking hay bales. Children, their movements mechanical and exhausted. Their clothes ragged. There they are, he whispered to Beckett. They watched from concealment as the children finished their work and were herded into one of the barracks by an armed overseer. A lock clicked shut, and the overseer walked away, leaving the children secured for the night. Beckett pulled out a small notebook and began sketching the ranch layout, noting the positions of buildings and guards. "We'll need at least 10 men to raid this place safely. Maybe more if Reese has his whole crew on site. Can we get that many marshals here in time? I'll ride back to Trinidad tonight and send telegrams. Kane can have a team here in 4 days, maybe 3 if they push hard." Beckett closed his notebook. "In the meantime, we watch and gather evidence. Find out how many children are here, what condition they're in, how many men Reese has working for him." They established a surveillance point in the rocks above the ranch and took turns watching through the night. As the hours passed, Ethan counted children being released from the barracks in the morning, working through the day, and locked up again at night. 14 total, ranging in age from maybe 8 to 15. All of them moved with the careful wariness of people who'd learned that mistakes brought punishment. On the second day, Ethan saw something that made his blood boil. One of the smaller children, a girl who couldn't have been more than 9, stumbled while carrying a heavy bucket. The water spilled, and an overseer strode over and struck her across the face hard enough to knock her down. She scrambled back to her feet, blood running from her nose, and hurried to refill the bucket without making a sound. Ethan's hand dropped to his pistol, but Beckett grabbed his wrist. "Not yet," the marshal whispered. "If we move now, some of those children might get caught in the crossfire. We wait for reinforcements." "How long are we supposed to watch them get hurt?" "As long as it takes to make sure we can get them out safely." Beckett's voice was hard but not unkind. "I know it's difficult, but this is what I meant about patience being the hard part." Ethan forced himself to release his pistol and return to watching. Every moment felt like betrayal, seeing those children suffer and doing nothing, but he understood Beckett's logic. A premature rescue attempt could get someone killed. On the third day, riders arrived at the ranch. 3 men wearing expensive clothes, riding fine horses, carrying themselves with the authority of people who expected deference. Reese greeted them personally, and they spent an hour touring the ranch while the children were conspicuously kept out of sight. After the visitors left, Beckett turned to Ethan with grim satisfaction. "Those were buyers. I'd bet money on it. Reese is showing off his operation, probably negotiating to purchase more children or sell the labor of the ones he has." "Did you recognize any of them?" "One looked familiar. I think he's a mine owner out of Pueblo. I'll include that in my report." Beckett checked his pocket watch. "The reinforcements should be here by tomorrow night. We'll coordinate a dawn raid the day after, hit them when they're sleepy and unprepared." That evening, as they waited in the rocks, Ethan found himself thinking about all the children he'd encountered over the past few weeks. Iris and Miguel and Anna and all the others, each one carrying scars from what had been done to them. And now 14 more, working under brutal conditions, their childhoods stolen by men who saw them as nothing more than cheap labor. "Does it ever get easier?" he asked Beckett. "Seeing this kind of thing?" "No, and if it does, that's when you need to quit." The old marshal's face was shadowed in the twilight. "The day you can watch children being hurt and not feel anything is the day you've lost what makes you human. The anger and the pain, those are what keep you fighting." The federal marshals arrived the next night, 8 hard-eyed men led by Marshal Vega. They gathered in a canyon a mile from the ranch and planned the raid with military precision. Vega would lead 4 men to secure the main house and arrest Reese. Beckett would take 2 men to the barracks and protect the children. Ethan and the remaining marshal would cut off the escape routes and make sure nobody ran. They moved out at 4 in the morning, the world still dark and silent. Ethan's heart hammered as they crept through the pre-dawn shadows, spreading out to their assigned positions. He could see the barracks where the children were locked, and the main house where Reese presumably slept, and the barns where ranch hands would be waking soon. Then Vega gave the signal, and everything happened at once. The marshals hit the main house with overwhelming force, smashing through doors and shouting commands. Ethan heard Reese bellowing in rage, heard the crash of furniture and the crack of a pistol shot. He ran toward the barracks where Beckett was already breaking the lock, pulling the door open to reveal 14 terrified children huddled against the walls. "Federal marshals," Beckett shouted. "You're safe now. Stay down and stay quiet." Ranch hands poured out of the other barracks, confused and angry. Some reached for weapons, but the marshals were ready, their rifles trained and their commands clear. 2 men tried to run and were tackled by waiting lawmen. The rest surrendered when they realized they were surrounded. Within 15 minutes, it was over. Reese was in chains, cursing and threatening lawsuits. His men were disarmed and sitting in the dirt under guard. And the 14 children were being led out of the barracks into the morning light, blinking and frightened but safe. Ethan knelt down in front of the girl he'd seen get struck 2 days earlier. Her nose was still swollen, and she flinched when he reached toward her. "It's all right," he said gently. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. We're taking you somewhere safe." She stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face for signs of deception. Then slowly, tentatively, she nodded. They loaded the children onto a wagon borrowed from Reese's own barn and began the journey back to Trinidad. Vega stayed behind with 2 marshals to search the ranch for evidence and guard the prisoners. Beckett and Ethan rode alongside the wagon, watching the children gradually relax as they put distance between themselves and their captivity. The girl Ethan had spoken to earlier edged closer to the front of the wagon until she was sitting just behind him. "Mister?" He turned in his saddle. "Yes? Are you really taking us somewhere safe, or is this another lie?" It was the same question Iris had asked, the same skepticism Miguel had voiced. These children had learned not to trust, and Ethan couldn't blame them for it. "It's really safe," he said. "There's an orphanage in Santa Fe run by a priest named Father Dominguez. He's a good man, and he'll take care of you until we can find your families or place you with people who will treat you right." "What if we don't have families?" "Then you'll stay at the orphanage as long as you need. And I promise you, nobody's going to sell you or hurt you or lock you up again. That's over now." She studied him with ancient eyes. "You promise a lot of things. Only the ones I can keep." They reached Trinidad by nightfall and secured the children in the boarding house under guard while they waited for transport to Santa Fe. Word of the raid spread quickly, and within hours, townspeople were gathering outside, demanding to know what happened. Vega addressed them from the boarding house steps, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority. "Dalton Reese has been arrested for kidnapping, child trafficking, and slavery. The children recovered from his ranch were illegally purchased through a corrupt placement program and forced into labor. They are now in federal custody and will be returned to Santa Fe for care and reunification with families if possible." "Reese is a respected businessman," someone shouted from the crowd. "You can't just accuse him without proof." "We have proof. Documents, witnesses, and the testimony of the children themselves." Vega's expression was hard. "And anyone who aided Reese in this operation will also be prosecuted. That's not a threat. It's a promise." The crowd murmured, some angry, some shocked. But nobody tried to stop them when they loaded the children onto a stagecoach the next morning and began the journey south. Ethan rode alongside the coach, watching the children through the windows. Some slept, exhausted from their ordeal. Others stared out at the passing landscape with expressions of cautious hope. They'd been rescued, but they weren't healed. That would take time and care, and people willing to prove that not all adults were monsters. They reached Santa Fe with 2 days to spare before the trial. Father Dominguez met them at the orphanage, his face lighting up when he saw the children. He gathered them into his arms one by one, speaking soft words of welcome while the nuns prepared beds and food. Ethan watched the reunion from a distance, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into his bones. In 3 weeks, he'd traveled hundreds of miles, arrested 3 criminals, recovered 24 children, and helped dismantle a trafficking operation that had destroyed countless lives. It should have felt like victory. But all he could think about were the children still out there, scattered across the territory in places he couldn't reach. The ones who'd died before help arrived. The ones who'd been sold to buyers who'd never kept records. The invisible victims who'd never get justice. "You can't save them all," Beckett said quietly, appearing beside him. "But you saved enough. That has to be enough." Ethan nodded, but the words felt hollow. How many was enough? When did you get to stop carrying the weight of the ones you missed? He didn't have an answer. He just knew he had to keep trying. The trial of Judge Harlan Westfield began on a Tuesday morning in late September, in a federal courthouse that had been built specifically to handle cases too corrupt for the territorial system. The building sat on a hill overlooking Santa Fe, its stone walls solid and imposing, designed to communicate that justice here would be different from the kind Westfield had dispensed. Ethan arrived early and found the courtroom already packed. Journalists from newspapers across the territory filled the gallery. their pencils poised to record every detail of what promised to be the most sensational trial in recent memory. Townspeople crowded the remaining seats, some supporting Westfield, others demanding his conviction. Federal marshals lined the walls, their presence a reminder that this was a matter of national importance. Marshal Kane sat at the prosecution table with a team of attorneys sent from Washington. They'd spent the past 2 weeks preparing their case, interviewing witnesses, and organizing the mountain of evidence into a narrative that would be impossible to refute. Ethan had spent hours with them, walking through his testimony, learning how to present facts clearly without editorial commentary. Westfield entered the courtroom in chains, flanked by guards. He'd aged visibly in the weeks since his arrest. His silver hair had thinned, his expensive clothes hung loose on his frame, and the confident bearing that had defined him was gone. But his eyes still held calculation, still searched the room for allies or escape routes. His attorney was a sharp-faced man from Denver named Carlisle, known for defending the indefensible and winning through procedural tricks and jury manipulation. He leaned close to Westfield, whispering strategy while his eyes assessed the jury. 12 men drawn from communities across the territory, none from Santa Fe, where Westfield's influence ran deep. The judge presiding over the trial was a federal appointee named Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s who'd made her reputation prosecuting corruption in the railway industry. She called the court to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, and the murmuring crowd fell silent. "The United States versus Harlan Westfield," she announced. "The defendant is charged with conspiracy to commit kidnapping, human trafficking, slavery, and corruption of public office. How does the defendant plead?" Westfield stood, his chains rattling. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The prosecution's opening statement was delivered by a federal attorney named Harrison, a compact man with a quiet voice that somehow commanded attention. He laid out the case methodically, describing how Westfield had used his position as a territorial judge to create a legal framework for trafficking children. He referenced the ledgers, the confession, the testimony that would come from victims and witnesses. Over the course of 6 years, Harrison said, pacing slowly before the jury, Judge Westfield signed placement orders for over 400 children. He claimed to be acting in their best interests, finding them homes and families. But the evidence will show that he was actually selling these children to buyers who used them as slave labor in mines, ranches, and factories across the territory. The evidence will show that he profited from their suffering, receiving payments for each child delivered. And the evidence will show that when children died from abuse or neglect, he simply processed more orders and sold more victims. Harrison paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. This was not a mistake. This was not negligence. This was systematic, calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable members of our society, and the law demands that such actions be met with the full force of justice. Carlisle's opening statement took a different approach. He painted Westfield as a dedicated public servant overwhelmed by the orphan crisis, a man who'd tried to help children but had been deceived by unscrupulous brokers like Reynolds and Garrett. He argued that Westfield had no direct knowledge of where the children were actually going, that he'd relied on forged documents and false representations. "My client signed placement orders in good faith," Carlisle said earnestly. He believed he was helping children find homes. If those children were subsequently mistreated, that is a tragedy. But it is not Judge Westfield's crime. The law requires proof of criminal intent, and the prosecution will be unable to provide such proof. It was a thin defense, but Carlisle delivered it with conviction. Ethan watched the jury's faces, trying to gauge their reactions. Most looked skeptical, but a few seemed willing to consider the possibility that Westfield had been duped rather than complicit. The prosecution spent the next 3 days building their case with meticulous precision. They called clerks from the courthouse who testified about Westfield's unusual interest in orphan placements, about the volume of orders he processed compared to other judges. They called merchants who'd seen Westfield meeting with Reynolds and other brokers, conducting business that looked nothing like charitable placement work. Then they brought out the ledgers. Harrison walked the jury through Westfield's own records, page by page, showing them the handwritten notes beside each child's name, the dollar amounts, the notation about which buyers paid premium prices for healthy children, the careful tracking of inventory and sales. "These are not the records of a man trying to help children," Harrison said, holding up the ledger. These are the records of a businessman managing merchandise. Carlyle objected repeatedly, arguing that the ledgers were taken illegally and should be excluded. But Morrison overruled him each time, noting that federal marshals had obtained a proper warrant before searching Westfield's office. On the fourth day, they called Sutton to the stand. Westfield's former clerk looked like he'd aged a decade. His hand shook as he was sworn in, and his voice was barely audible when he confirmed his identity. Harrison led him through his testimony gently, establishing his role in Westfield's office and his knowledge of the placement program. Did Judge Westfield know that the children were being sold rather than placed with families? Harrison asked. Yes, sir. He knew. He arranged it. Sutton wouldn't look at Westfield. He'd meet with the buyers, negotiate prices, make sure the paperwork looked legitimate. He told me it was just business, that the orphans were better off working than starving in institutions. Did you object to this arrangement? At first, yes. But he said if I didn't help, he'd make sure I never worked again. And after a while, Sutton's voice broke. After a while, I stopped thinking of them as children. It was just paperwork, just filing documents and collecting payments. How many children do you estimate were trafficked through this system? Over 400 that I know of, maybe more before I started working there. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Morrison called for order, her gavel cracking like a gunshot. Carlyle's cross-examination was brutal. He attacked Sutton's credibility, pointing out that the clerk had benefited financially from the scheme and was now testifying to save himself from prosecution. He suggested that Sutton was lying about Westfield's involvement to secure a plea deal. But Sutton held firm. I'm not lying. I wish I was, but I'm not. Judge Westfield knew exactly what he was doing, and he didn't care who got hurt. On the sixth day, they called the children to testify. The courtroom fell silent as Miguel walked to the witness stand. He was dressed in clean clothes donated by townspeople, his hair neatly combed, but nothing could hide the wariness in his eyes. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth in a voice that didn't waver. Harrison kept his questions simple and direct. Miguel, can you tell the jury what happened after you left the orphanage with Mr. Reynolds? The boy's testimony was devastating. He described the promises Reynolds had made, the long journey to Durango, the moment when they realized there were no families waiting. He talked about the mining camp, the hours underground, the overseer who'd beaten him when he couldn't lift a full ore bucket. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone that somehow made the horror worse. Did Mr. Reynolds ever mention Judge Westfield? Harrison asked. Yes, sir. He said the judge had made all the arrangements, that the judge got a percentage of what we sold for. He laughed about it, said the judge was the smartest man he knew because he'd figured out how to make money off kids nobody wanted. Carlyle tried to shake Miguel's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting the boy had misunderstood or was confused. But Miguel met his questions with steady clarity, never contradicting himself, never showing uncertainty. I know what I heard, Miguel said when Carlyle pressed him. And I know what happened to me. You can try to make it sound different, but it doesn't change the truth. Anna testified next, then Robert, then Carmen. Each one told similar stories, promises broken, trust betrayed, childhood stolen. By the time the last child finished, several jurors were openly wiping their eyes. The children from Reese's ranch testified the following day. The girl Ethan had seen struck described the brutal working conditions, the inadequate food, the locked barracks at night. She pointed to Reese in the gallery, identifying him as the man who'd bought them from Reynolds and put them to work. Did anyone ever come to check on your welfare? Harrison asked. No, sir. Nobody came. Nobody cared. Her voice was small but clear. We thought maybe someone would notice we were gone, but nobody ever did. On the eighth day, Ethan took the stand. He'd been dreading this moment, uncomfortable with the attention and the weight of so many eyes watching him. But as he settled into the witness chair and looked out at the courtroom, he found his nervousness fading. This wasn't about him. It was about the children, and he owed them his best effort. Harrison walked him through the discovery of the wagon in the Sonoran Desert, the confrontation with Garrett's men, the decision to investigate the Santa Fe operation. Ethan described breaking into Westfield's office, finding the ledgers, coercing Sutton's confession. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry their own weight. Why did you risk your life to help these children? Harrison asked. Ethan thought about all the easy answers he could give: duty, morality, basic human decency. But none of them captured the real truth. Because I stopped, he said finally. I found that wagon in the desert, and I could have ridden past. Could have told myself it wasn't my problem, that someone else would handle it. But I stopped. And once I saw those children dying, once I understood what had been done to them, I couldn't walk away. Not then, not ever. Carlisle's cross-examination focused on the legality of Ethan's actions. He hammered on the break-in, the coerced confession, the lack of warrants or proper procedure. You're not a trained law enforcement officer, are you, Mr. Cole? I wasn't then. I am now. But at the time you broke into Judge Westfield's office, you were just a freight hauler with no legal authority. That's right? And you felt entitled to break the law in pursuit of what you believed was justice? Ethan met Carlisle's eyes steadily. I felt compelled to stop children from being sold into slavery. If that required bending some rules about locked doors and office hours, then yes, I'd do it again. Even though such actions could compromise the entire case? Even though evidence obtained illegally might be thrown out of court? Federal marshals obtained proper warrants before seizing Westfield's records. Nothing I did compromised the legal case. It just pointed the marshals in the right direction. Carlisle tried several more angles of attack, but Ethan refused to be rattled. He'd lived through gunfights and desert crossings and confrontations with armed traffickers. A lawyer's hostile questions didn't scare him. The prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony. They'd presented overwhelming evidence, documents, witnesses, victim testimony, financial records showing payments from buyers to Westfield's accounts. The case was as solid as any Ethan had seen. Carlisle's defense was brief and largely unsuccessful. He called character witnesses who testified to Westfield's years of public service, his charitable donations, his reputation as a fair judge. But their testimony rang hollow against the weight of evidence showing systematic trafficking. Westfield himself did not testify. Carlisle advised against it, knowing the prosecution would destroy him on cross-examination. Closing arguments began on a Friday morning. Harrison spoke for 3 hours, walking the jury through every piece of evidence, connecting the dots from Westfield's placement orders to the children found in mines and ranches across the territory. The defense wants you to believe Judge Westfield was a victim of circumstance, an innocent man deceived by criminals, Harrison said. But the evidence shows otherwise. The evidence shows a man who systematically exploited his position for profit, who treated children as merchandise, who enabled slavery under the cover of law, and the evidence demands a verdict of guilty. Carlisle made a valiant effort in his closing, arguing reasonable doubt and attacking the credibility of witnesses who'd accepted plea deals. But even he seemed to know it was hopeless. The case against Westfield was too strong, the evidence too damning. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their foreman was a rancher from the Eastern Territory, a weathered man who'd sat through every moment of testimony with a stone face. On the charge of conspiracy to commit kidnapping, how do you find? Judge Morrison asked. Guilty. On the charge of human trafficking? Guilty. On the charge of slavery? Guilty. On the charge of corruption of public office? Guilty. Westfield's face went gray. He swayed in his seat, and his attorney had to steady him. The courtroom erupted in shouts, some celebrating, others protesting. Morrison called for order, her gavel cracking repeatedly until the noise subsided. Harlan Westfield, you have been found guilty on all counts. Sentencing will take place 1 week from today. Until then, you will remain in federal custody. She looked at the former judge with something like pity. May you find whatever redemption is available to men who profit from the suffering of children. Westfield was led away in chains, his shoulders slumped, his confident bearing finally and completely broken. Ethan watched him go and felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, just tired relief that this part at least was over. Reynolds' trial followed immediately, and it was even shorter. With Westfield already convicted and the evidence overwhelming, Reynolds' attorney negotiated a guilty plea in exchange for cooperation, identifying other buyers and brokers in the network. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole if his information led to additional arrests. Reese went to trial a week later and was convicted in 3 days. The evidence from his ranch, the locked barracks, the brutal working conditions, the testimony of 14 children left no room for doubt. He received 15 years to be served at hard labor in the territorial penitentiary. Westfield's sentencing hearing was scheduled for early October. The courtroom was packed again, with every seat filled and people standing in the aisles. Ethan sat beside Marshal Kane, watching as Westfield was brought in looking even more diminished than before. Judge Morrison reviewed the case one final time, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. He carried himself with quiet dignity as he faced the judge who'd destroyed so many lives. "Miguel, you were one of Judge Westfield's victims. What would you like to say to him?" The boy turned to look at Westfield directly. "I want to say I forgive you, but I can't. What you did to us was too big, hurt too many people, but I also don't want to spend my life hating you, because that would mean you still had power over me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "So I'm not going to think about you anymore. I'm going to think about the people who saved me and the life I'm going to build, and the fact that I survived despite what you tried to do. That's the only revenge I need." Morrison nodded. "Anna Chen?" Anna approached and stood beside Miguel. "I used to have nightmares about you," she said to Westfield, "about being locked in that wagon, about the mine, about all of it. But Father Dominguez told me that fear only has the power I give it, so I'm taking that power back. You're just a man. A bad man who did terrible things, but you're not a monster and you don't control my life anymore." One by one, the children approached and spoke. Some expressed anger, others forgiveness, others simply the desire to move forward. Iris was among them, having traveled from Tucson specifically for this hearing. "You tried to make us believe we didn't matter," she said, her voice clear and strong, "that we were just things to be bought and sold. But Mr. Cole showed us different. He stopped when he could have kept going. He fought when it was dangerous. He proved that we do matter, that our lives have value. So whatever happens to you now doesn't change that truth." When the last child had spoken, Morrison called for a recess. She returned an hour later with her decision written on formal court papers. "Harlan Westfield, I hereby sentence you to death by hanging, to be carried out at the Territorial Penitentiary 6 weeks from today. May the law have mercy on your soul, because the children you destroyed cannot." Westfield made no sound as the sentence was pronounced. He simply bowed his head and accepted what was coming. The weeks following the sentencing were busy ones for Ethan and the federal marshals. Using information from Reynolds and the ledgers, they organized raids across the territory, 43 operations in total, from mining camps to ranches to factories. Not every raid was successful. Some buyers had heard about the arrests and fled, taking the children with them or simply abandoning them. Others fought back, resulting in shootouts that left several marshals wounded and 2 buyers dead. But slowly, steadily, children were recovered. By the end of November, Kane's teams had found and rescued 163 children from various locations. They ranged in age from 6 to 17, and their conditions varied from relatively healthy to severely traumatized. All of them were taken to orphanages or temporary shelters, while marshals worked to locate their families or find suitable permanent placements. Ethan participated in 12 of the raids, traveling with different marshal teams to locations across the territory. Each rescue brought its own challenges: suspicious buyers, resistant communities, children too traumatized to trust their rescuers. But each successful recovery also brought the satisfaction of knowing another life had been saved from darkness. In early December, he returned to Santa Fe to find the orphanage transformed. What had been a quiet facility housing 20 children was now bustling with over 50, the overflow sleeping in temporary buildings erected in the courtyard. Father Dominguez moved through the chaos with calm efficiency, organizing meals and classes and medical care with the help of nuns recruited from across the territory. Ethan found Iris in the courtyard teaching younger children to read, her finger moving along the lines of a primer while they followed her words. She looked up when she saw him and smiled. A real smile, the first he'd seen from her that reached her eyes. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." "I know, but I still wasn't completely sure until I saw you." She gestured to the children around her. "These are some of the ones you rescued. I've been helping Father Dominguez take care of them." Ethan sat down beside her and listened as she explained her routine, helping with lessons in the morning, assisting in the kitchen at midday, reading to the younger children in the evening. She'd found purpose in helping others heal from trauma she understood too well. "You're good at this," Ethan observed. "I have to be good at something. Father Dominguez says everyone has gifts they can use to help others. I think mine might be understanding what it's like to be scared and helping other people feel less alone." They sat together for a while, watching the children play in the fading afternoon light. Some laughed and ran, already beginning to recover from their ordeals. Others sat quietly, still carrying the weight of what had been done to them. All of them were safe, and that was what mattered. "What's going to happen to all of us?" Iris asked eventually. "There's too many for the orphanage to keep forever." Marshal Kane is working with the territorial government to establish a new system. Real oversight this time, with background checks and home visits and regulations to prevent what Westfield did from happening again. It'll take time to find families for everyone, but they'll make sure the placements are legitimate. "And what about you? Are you staying in Santa Fe?" "For now, there's still work to do, more children to find, more buyers to arrest. Kane's offered me a permanent position as a deputy federal marshal. I think I'm going to accept." Iris nodded solemnly. "You should. You're good at saving people." "I'm good at showing up when I'm needed. The children do the actual surviving. That's the hard part." Miguel joined them as the sun set, followed by Ana and several of the other children Ethan had rescued. They gathered around him like he was a campfire, drawn to the warmth and safety his presence represented. He told them stories about his recent raids, editing out the violence but keeping the victories. They listened with rapt attention, asking questions and offering opinions. Father Dominguez watched from the doorway of the chapel, his expression thoughtful. When the children finally dispersed to prepare for supper, he walked over and sat beside Ethan. "You've become important to them," the priest said, "a symbol of hope and safety." "I'm just one person. There are dozens of marshals doing this work." "Yes, but you were the first. You were the one who stopped when others would have passed by. That means something to children who've been invisible their whole lives." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I can't be a father figure to all of them. There's too many, and I'm not qualified." "I don't think they need you to be a father. They just need you to be consistent, to keep showing up, keep proving that adults can be trusted." Dominguez smiled. "That's a gift in itself." On December 15th, Harlan Westfield was hanged at the Territorial Penitentiary. Ethan didn't attend. He had no desire to watch a man die, even one who deserved it. But he read the newspaper accounts later, learning that Westfield had maintained his composure to the end, making no final statement and showing no remorse. Reynolds, watching from his cell, reportedly wept when he heard the news. He still had 20 years to serve, 2 decades to contemplate the lives he'd destroyed in pursuit of profit. Christmas came to Santa Fe with rare snowfall that blanketed the city in white. The orphanage celebrated with donations from townspeople who'd been moved by the children's stories. Toys, warm clothes, special foods. Marshal Kane visited and distributed badges to the children, tin stars that made them honorary junior marshals. They wore them with fierce pride, and for a few hours the darkness they'd endured seemed very far away. Ethan spent Christmas Day at the orphanage, helping serve meals and organize games. Iris stayed close to him, and at one point she asked the question he'd been expecting. "Have you found my family yet?" He'd been dreading this conversation. "We've been looking, but we haven't had any luck. The records from your original orphanage were incomplete, and—" "It's all right," she interrupted gently. "I don't think I have family to find. My mother died when I was 4, and I never knew my father. That's how I ended up in the orphanage in the first place." "I'm sorry. Don't be. It's just the truth." She looked up at him with those ancient eyes. "But I was wondering. Sister Catherine said some of the children might be adopted by people here in Santa Fe, people who want families and are willing to take in kids like us. Do you think anyone would want me?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Iris, any family would be lucky to have you. You're smart and brave and kind. You help the other children. You work hard. You never give up. Of course someone will want you." "Would you want me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He looked at this child who'd been through hell and somehow emerged with her spirit intact, who'd stood up to Garrett and comforted dying children and learned to trust again despite every reason not to. She was asking if she could belong to him, if he would be the family she'd never had.
and Ethan realized with sudden clarity that he wanted that too.
Not out of pity or obligation, but because Iris had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. She represented everything he was fighting for: resilience in the face of cruelty, hope despite trauma, the possibility of healing. "I'm not sure I'd be a very good father," he said carefully. "I'm gone a lot for martial work. I don't have much experience with children, and I'm still learning how to do this job without getting killed." "That's not what I asked." Iris's voice was patient. "I asked if you'd want me." Ethan knelt down so they were eye level. "Yes, I'd want you. If you'd be willing to take a chance on someone who's going to make mistakes and won't always know the right thing to say, then yes, I'd be honored." Iris threw her arms around his neck, holding tight enough that he could barely breathe. "I'll take that chance." The legal process of adoption took months. There were background checks and home visits and interviews with territorial officials who wanted to make sure Ethan was suitable. Father Dominguez vouched for him, as did Marshal Kane and several of the children Ethan had rescued. In March, a judge, a real one, honest and careful, signed the papers making Iris officially Ethan Cole's daughter. She moved into his small house on the edge of Santa Fe, bringing with her a single bag of possessions and a determination to build a new life. Ethan converted his spare room into a bedroom for her, painting the walls yellow because she said it reminded her of sunshine. They established routines: breakfast together before Ethan left for martial duty, supper when he returned, evenings spent reading or talking about their days. It wasn't always easy. Iris had nightmares about the wagon in the desert, nights when she woke up screaming and couldn't remember where she was. Ethan had his own struggles: guilt about the children he hadn't saved and the constant weight of knowing there were more victims still out there. But they helped each other through it, learning how to be a family despite neither of them quite knowing how. The recovery operations continued through the spring. By April, Kane's teams had rescued 214 children from various locations across the territory. Some were reunited with families who'd thought them dead. Others were placed in legitimate adoptive homes after careful vetting. Still others remained in orphanages, waiting for families or simply healing from trauma too deep for quick resolution. Miguel was adopted by a rancher near Taos who'd lost his own son to illness and wanted to give another boy a chance. Anna found a home with a Chinese merchant family in San Francisco who'd heard about the rescued children and traveled to Santa Fe specifically to meet her. Robert and Carmen stayed at the orphanage, choosing to remain together and help Father Dominguez with the younger children rather than separate into different families. Not every story ended happily. 63 children from Westfield's ledger were never found, presumed dead or lost to buyers who'd covered their tracks too well. Their names were recorded in a memorial book that Father Dominguez kept in the chapel, a reminder of the cost of indifference and the importance of vigilance. In May, Ethan was formally sworn in as a deputy federal marshal in a ceremony at the territorial courthouse. Iris attended, wearing a new dress and sitting in the front row beside Father Dominguez. When Ethan raised his right hand and swore to uphold the law and protect those who couldn't protect themselves, he thought about the wagon in the desert and the choice he'd made to stop. Everything since then had flowed from that single decision: the raids and the arrests, the children saved and the families reunited, this new life he'd built. After the ceremony, Marshal Kane pulled him aside. "I have a new assignment for you, if you're interested." "What kind of assignment?" "We've received reports of a trafficking operation running out of Denver. Different from Westfield's system. This one targets immigrant children, Chinese and Irish mostly. Kids whose families can't navigate the legal system or don't speak English well enough to complain when their children disappear." Kane handed him a folder. "I want you to investigate. See if the reports are credible, and if they are, build a case we can prosecute." Ethan opened the folder and scanned the contents. Reports from concerned citizens, suspicious placement orders, children who'd vanished without explanation. It was depressingly familiar. "How long do I have?" "As long as it takes to do it right. We're not in a hurry. We're in this for the long haul." Kane's expression was serious. "The work you did in Santa Fe saved hundreds of lives. But there are more operations out there, more children being exploited. This doesn't end with Westfield. It probably never ends." "I know." Ethan closed the folder. "When do I leave?" "Week after next." That gives you time to make arrangements. Kane glanced at Iris, who was talking animatedly with Father Dominguez. And to explain to your daughter why you have to go. Telling Iris was harder than Ethan expected. She took the news quietly, her face carefully neutral in the way that meant she was hiding fear. How long will you be gone? She asked. I don't know. A few weeks, maybe longer. And you'll be in danger? He wouldn't lie to her. Possibly. But I'll be careful, and I'll have other marshals with me. We look out for each other. Iris was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then she looked up at him with those ancient eyes. You have to go, don't you? Because there are more children like us who need help. Yes. And if you don't go, they might not get saved. That's right. She nodded slowly. Then you should go, but you have to promise to come back. Really promise, not just say it. I promise, Iris, I'll come back every time, no matter how long it takes or how far I have to travel. I'll always come back to you. Okay. She stood and hugged him, and Ethan held her close, feeling the weight of the promise he'd just made. It was a promise he'd keep or die trying, because this child had trusted him with something infinitely precious, her belief that adults could be counted on, that promises could be real. 2 weeks later, Ethan rode north toward Denver, leaving Iris in Father Dominguez's care. She stood at the orphanage gate waving goodbye, trying to be brave despite the fear in her eyes. Ethan waved back until she disappeared from view, then turned his horse toward the mountains and the work that waited. The Denver investigation took 3 months. Ethan worked undercover, posing as a buyer interested in cheap labor for a fictional mining operation. He met with brokers, examined their networks, documented their crimes. When he had enough evidence, he contacted Kane and coordinated a series of raids that recovered 42 children from various locations around Denver. He returned to Santa Fe in August to find Iris waiting on the porch, a letter in her hand. You wrote every week like you promised, she said, waving the letters. Father Dominguez helped me keep them organized. I told you I'd write. Ethan dismounted and walked up the steps. Did you get the presents I sent? The books? Yes, I've read 3 of them already. She smiled. And I have a present for you too. She handed him a piece of paper covered in careful handwriting. It was an essay about courage, about what it meant to stand up when it was easier to walk away, about the difference between heroes and people who just did what needed to be done. At the bottom, she'd written, For my father, who taught me that stopping is the beginning of everything that matters. Ethan read it twice, his vision blurring with tears. This is beautiful, Iris. Miss Patterson at school said I should enter it in a territory-wide writing competition. Do you think I should? I think you should do whatever makes you happy, whether that's writing or teaching or becoming a marshal yourself someday. I don't want to be a marshal. Iris's voice was firm. I want to be a teacher, so I can help children who don't have families understand that they're still important, that their lives still matter. That sounds perfect. They went inside together, and Iris told him about everything he'd missed, her progress in school, the new children who'd arrived at the orphanage, Father Dominguez's plans to expand the facilities. She talked fast and excitedly, filling the space with words like she was afraid silence would let loneliness creep back in. Ethan listened, asking questions, and sharing stories from Denver, editing out the danger but keeping the victories. And as the evening light faded and they sat down to the supper Iris had helped prepare, he realized that this was what he'd been missing all those lonely years on the freight roads. Not just family, but purpose. The knowledge that he was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered. Over the next 5 years, Ethan continued his work as a deputy federal marshal, investigating trafficking operations and recovering children across the territory. The work was hard and sometimes dangerous, but it was also deeply satisfying. Each child rescued, each trafficker arrested, felt like a small victory against the darkness he'd first encountered in the Sonoran Desert. Iris grew from a traumatized 8-year-old into a confident young woman. She excelled in school, particularly in writing and literature. She volunteered at the orphanage, helping newer arrivals adjust to safety and teaching them that trust was possible. She wrote letters to the other children Ethan had rescued, maintaining connections and building a network of survivors who supported each other. When she turned 16, she received a letter from Miguel. He'd settled into his life with the rancher near Taos and was learning the cattle business. But he'd never forgotten the children who'd suffered alongside him, and he'd saved money to establish a scholarship fund for orphans pursuing education. He wanted Iris to be one of the first recipients. "This is too much," Iris said, staring at the letter. "I can't accept this." "Why not?" Ethan asked. "Ethan, because other children need it more than I do. You've given me everything, a home, a family, opportunities. There are kids out there with nothing, and you'll help them someday. But first, you need to help yourself. Accept the scholarship, go to college, become the teacher you want to be. Then you can spend the rest of your life making sure other children get the same chances." She looked at him with tears in her eyes. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I just know that saving people isn't just about pulling them out of immediate danger. Sometimes it's about giving them the tools to save themselves." Iris attended the Territorial Teachers College in Albuquerque, graduating with honors at age 20. She returned to Santa Fe and took a position at a school for orphans and disadvantaged children, where she taught reading and writing with patience and compassion informed by her own experience. Ethan continued his marshal work, now focusing on training younger deputies in the techniques he'd developed over years of trafficking investigations. The territory had established new laws and oversight systems to prevent another Westfield situation, but vigilance was still required. There would always be people willing to exploit the vulnerable, and there would always be a need for lawmen willing to stop them. On a cool October evening, 10 years after he'd found that wagon in the desert, Ethan sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the Sangre de Cristo Mountains gold and crimson. Iris sat beside him, grading papers from her students. She was 28 now, engaged to a young lawyer who worked on behalf of immigrant families. She'd built a good life, full of purpose and connection. "I got a letter from Father Dominguez today," she said, setting aside her papers. "He's retiring next year. The Archdiocese is throwing him a celebration, and he wants us to speak at it." "What does he want us to say?" "Just our story. How he helped us. How the orphanage became a place of healing instead of just a holding facility." Iris paused. "Will you do it?" Ethan thought about the priest who'd ridden with him to Durango, who'd helped rescue children and rebuild broken lives. "Yeah, I'll do it." "Good, because I already told him we would." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light fade from the sky. Then Iris said, "Do you ever think about that day in the desert when you found the wagon?" "Every day." "Do you regret stopping?" Ethan considered the question carefully. The past 10 years had been hard, the investigations, the danger, the constant weight of knowing there were still children suffering in places he couldn't reach. But they'd also been the most meaningful years of his life. He'd saved hundreds of children, arrested dozens of traffickers, helped build systems that protected the vulnerable, and he'd gained a daughter who filled his life with joy and purpose. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. Stopping was the best decision I ever made." "Even though you can't save everyone?" "Even though. Because the ones I did save mattered just as much as the ones I couldn't, and every life rescued is worth the effort, worth the risk." Iris leaned against his shoulder. "Sister Catherine told me something once. She said you can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean the ones you save don't count. She said sometimes you don't save the world, you just save enough, and that has to be enough." Ethan smiled, recognizing his own words spoken to Beckett years ago, now returned to him through the wisdom of the children he'd helped. "Sister Catherine is a smart woman. She learned from a smart man." They stayed on the porch until the stars appeared, talking about Iris's upcoming wedding and Ethan's latest case and the celebration for Father Dominguez. They talked about Miguel's ranch and Anna's life in San Francisco and all the other children who'd survived and built new lives from the ashes of trauma. And as the night deepened around them, Ethan felt something he'd never expected to feel again after all the years of hard roads and lonely camps. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, because the work was never finished and the memories never fully faded, but a deep satisfaction in knowing he'd done what mattered, that he'd stood up when it counted, that he'd stopped when others would have passed by. That wagon in the Sonoran Desert had changed everything. It had shown him that indifference was its own kind of evil, that turning away was a choice with consequences. And it had given him a purpose that transcended his own survival, his own comfort, his own fears. He'd found children dying in the heat, and he'd decided to stop. Everything else, the rescues, the arrests, The dismantling of a trafficking network, the family he'd built with Iris, had flowed from that single decision. Sometimes you don't save the world. Sometimes you just save enough. And as Ethan sat on his porch beside his daughter, watching the stars wheel overhead and feeling the piece of work well done, he understood that enough was exactly what it needed to be. It was enough to matter, enough to make a difference, enough to prove that when good people stood up, evil could be stopped. And sometimes that was everything.